Yeah, we're off. Hi, guys.
Because they don't have a television. So read it.
What does the Bible say about this and the dangers for Christians and children? What are the role models that are created? It's real. What's wrong with vampires, werewolves? How did he get in it? How did he get out of it? What does the Bible say about this and the dangers for Christians and children? What are the role models that are created and how Christians should be choosing their entertainment? Will you help me welcome?
Hey, Dane, good to see you.
Smuggler. God bless you, brother. Glad to have you.
Thank you. Thank you. Praise the Lord. Well, this is a kind of unusual topic tonight. I know many of you probably didn't even know such things were an issue. In fact, I was speaking to a pastor friend of mine a few weeks ago, and he says, "What are you going to be talking about next?" And I says, "Oh, I'm doing a thing on the Twilight Saga." And bless his heart, this guy and his wife were so innocent, they hadn't even heard about the Twilight books or movies. They don't have a television, and they don't read such books. And that's great. I said, "Hey, praise the Lord," but a lot of people do know what these things are and what's going on with them, especially young people. And that's part of why we're doing this. I have a testimony, which I'm sure some of you have already heard, about my involvement in witchcraft, in Freemasonry, in Mormonism, and Satanism, not necessarily in that order. And I'm not going to talk about that tonight, except toward the end, I'm going to explain about what's going on with my involvement with.
Hi, Gigabyte, good to see you.
But first of all, I want to share a scripture with you, and I want to get into the meat of the talk first, and at the end, I'll tell you how I got into it, and as Stan said, how I got out of it. So, if you got your Bibles, please go to Proverbs chapter 30. And starting in verse 14, this is a very strange passage. There's many passages in the Bible that are kind of challenging. You don't hear this one preached very much. But it says, starting in verse 14, "There is a generation whose teeth are as swords, and their drawn teeth as knives, to devour the poor from off the earth and the needy from among men. The horse leech hath two daughters, crying, Give, give. There are three things that are never satisfied, yea, four things that say not, it is enough. The grave, the barren womb, the earth that is not filled with water, and the fire that saith not, it is enough." Heavenly Father, as we come before you right now, in the name of Yeshua, we ask you that you would please bless this talk and fill me with your Holy Spirit. Let me share the things you want your people to hear, both here in this congregation and also through this DVD. That you might increase within me and that I might decrease, and that your name would be glorified above all else. In Yeshua's mighty name we pray. Amen. Okay.
Diane, I reckon Tucker Carlson got fired because he was probably the one that showed that fraud, the election fraud, that Fox News just paid $1 billion in damages for. I think it was on his show, and that's the real reason.
You'll notice that that's a very strange passage, as I said, and I'm not saying we need to take it literally, but yet I would submit to you that we're still seeing the fulfillment of some of this right now before our very eyes. And we're seeing a generation or two now.
Yeah, because he said on Friday, see you on Monday, so he's expecting to come back. He got sacked.
That has risen up, basically the generation that I was in, and even more so the generation that follows me, where people are increasingly, many of them, rather heartless. There's more and more talk about how the Generation X crowd is ready to throw their parents under the bus, so to speak, because there won't be any Social Security left for them, you know, things like that. And many, well, there's many wonderful young people out there. Don't get me wrong. There's many very compassionate, kind people that are in their 20s and 30s. There are also a lot of people that are very, very creepy, very much like what you see in this passage. And, you know, we understand what a horse leech does.
Yeah.
A horse leech sucks blood out of horses. Now, what does that mean? First, we're talking about teeth as swords, jaw teeth as knives, horse leech, you know, all this stuff. Maybe we're talking about something here that's going on. Maybe there's a prophetic component here we need to look at. But before we get into that, let's just talk briefly about what's going on right now. As we see in the media today, if you're not a very wholly separated Christian who never watches television, never goes to a movie, monsters are hot right now. We've got the Twilight books and films, which is sort of the inspiration for this talk. They are called the new Harry Potter. I mean, Harry Potter was the huge thing in the late 90s and the early part of the new millennium. Well, now this is the latest thing, targeted at young people. On TV, we have originally way back in the 90s and early part of the last millennium, we had Buffy the Vampire Slayer, Angel. Now we've got Vampire Diaries. We've got the HBO series True Blood, which is hugely popular. There have been all kinds of movies out there about vampires and werewolves, the Underworld trilogy, Howling movies, An American Werewolf in London. Now we're going to have a remake of the classic Wolfman movie with Lon Chaney Jr. from back in the 40s. So teens and adults are really going for these things. The books are enormously popular. And what's really bizarre is we've had people call us and tell us that Christian organizations are using the Twilight books for youth classes in their Sunday schools and for like vacation Bible schools, things like that.
No way.
So this is something I just felt led to speak on, because the problem is, I think most Christians are just of the opinion that this stuff is all fantasy. Just like years ago we would hear, oh, well, Harry Potter is just fantasy. And because it's fantasy, there's no problem with it. Well, that doesn't necessarily follow, because the imagination is the playground of either God or the devil. And if you pump a bunch of things that are occultic and fantastic and kind of dark into the imagination, whether it's a child, a teen, or an adult, that's going to be what ends up playing around in that imagination. And I would also point out to you that you will search far and wide in the Bible to find a good use.
Hey, Han, good to see you.
The very first time it's used, which is in, I think, the Tower of Babel story, you will find that imagination is considered dark, it's considered dangerous, and it darkens the hearts of men. And if you think about it, every sin that you have ever committed started with your imagination. Obviously, you can't sin without thinking about sin, whether it's stealing, whether it's gambling, whether it's sexual, whatever it might be. So, not that the imagination cannot be sanctified and cannot be used for good things. Certainly it can. But it can also be used for evil, just like any other human faculty. Now, here's the question. First of all, are vampires and werewolves just fantasy, superstitious, and legend? And we're going to deal with that in a couple of minutes. But the question becomes, even if they are fantasy, what should be the response to fantasy entertainment, especially for Christian young people? Because we've got over the years, many people ask us, well, what about, Tolkien? What about the Lord of the Rings? What about the C.S. Lewis Chronicles of Narnia books? Those are fantasy. And of course, Harry Potter. So these are other questions that need to be answered. The other thing is, aside from the fantasy stuff, what is the morality and the emotional issues that are being dealt with in these books and films? What kind of role models are being demonstrated in these films? How healthy are they really? And I can speak to that as well, because many years I was a counselor. I have a master's degree in counseling, and so I understand the emotional issues as well as hopefully the scriptural ones. Okay, we need in the beginning to remember Paul's words. He says in Philippians 4:8, finally, brethren, whatsoever things are true, whatsoever things are honest, whatsoever things are just, whatsoever things are pure, whatsoever things are lovely, whatsoever things are of good report, if there be any virtue, if there be any praise, think on these things. Now, when you read that passage, and I don't care what you're looking at, if you're looking at Harry Potter, or you're looking at the Twilight novels, or you're looking at werewolf movies, or whatever it might be, how does that fit in somehow? I don't see how it does. If a Christian is being exhorted, I don't care if it's a Christian adult or a Christian young person, that they need to be thinking upon things that are pure and lovely and honest and of good report, if there be any praise, that we are to think on these things. And just like so many other things, would you really want Yeshua, Jesus, sitting there in the theater next to you when you're watching the Twilight movies? Would you feel comfortable with that? Because he is there, because he lives in your heart. So think about these things. I have a hard time figuring out how vampires and werewolves fit into this passage. Okay, we're going to get right into it now. The question is, are vampires fantasy or are they real? Unfortunately, the answer to that is kind of equivocal. It's yes and no. And let me explain that by going the negative first. I would say, in my experience, there's no evidence for these ancient, immortal, vampires that are 500,000 years old, whatever the case might be. I met men that claimed to be that, but they could not prove it. And I had no reason to believe that. Now, from a Christian perspective, I doubt if that is the case. Now, the other thing is, you see over the years, you got to realize the whole vampire thing has evolved over literally millennia. We're going to talk a little about the history of it, but since especially the Dracula novel came out, there's been certain conventions in vampire fiction that vampires can do certain things. They can change, go back. They can turn into mist. They can, control your mind. Do all this kind of stuff. And frankly, a lot of that I don't have any reason to believe is true. Like a lot of stuff that's in Hollywood, it's just poppycock. But let's look at the affirmative side of the question. First of all, history. You will find, if you go back into history, that literally for as long as we've had human beings, in just about any culture imaginable, there have been the idea of a vampire, of some sort of animated corpse that sucks the blood of the living. This is what Carl Jung would call a universal archetype. And we see one of the earliest manifestations of this is a Sumerian goddess named Lilitu. And Lilitu was, you see there, that's one of many sculptures of her in the graphic, was a being who would prey upon children. She would come into the beds of children and infants at night and suck their blood. And, this was something that was very much feared. And when it came centuries later, the cross-pollination that occurred, because many of you may know that when the Israelites were taken into captivity in Babylon, there was a lot of intermingling of true biblical stuff with things of the Babylonian culture. And so by the time of the intertestamental period, there was this belief among certain sects of Judaism, and even up to this very day, in a Hebraic version of this goddess whose name is Lilith. Now, Lilith, you may have heard that name. She today is kind of like an icon among feminists, especially feminist Jews, because there's this long-standing legend about her, again, that she does prey on children. But supposedly, according to the rabbis, I'm not saying this is true, because I don't really believe it to be true, but they claim that Adam had a wife before Eve, and that this wife was called Lilith, and she was made out of the earth, just like Adam was. So they were equals. And this isn't in the Bible. And the story is that that Lilith got mad at Adam because he wanted to have dominion over her. And she says, well, why should you have dominion over me? We're equal. We both were made out of the earth. I'm just as equal as you are. And so Adam got upset and asked God for a divorce. And so they kicked Lilith out of the Garden of Eden. but not before she became pregnant by Adam. And so she's out there in the lone and dreary world, out of paradise, and is very angry at the Almighty, is angry, you know how divorces are, I mean, they're never pleasant. She's very angry at her ex-husband, and so when she gives birth, she takes the baby and smashes his brains out on the rocks of the Euphrates River. And out of his brains come all the demons in the universe. And so she is known as the mother of demons and kind of the mother of all vampires. And she's sort of the patron saint, if you will, of crib death. Today we call that SIDS, sudden infant death syndrome, when the baby mysteriously dies and there's no evident cause. Well, some Orthodox Jews would blame that on Lilith to this very day. In fact, they actually have a talisman. When a baby is born, there's all sorts of strange superstitions in Orthodox Judaism about this. That's why they won't name a baby until after he's circumcised. Because if they name him before he's circumcised, then Lilith might get him. The other thing they do is they put this amulet over the crib from the moment the baby's, home from the hospital, and it has 3 names on it: Sanvi, Sansanvi, and Samengalev. Those are the names of 3 angels that supposedly the Almighty created to keep Lilith away from babies. And so they pray and ask Sanvi, Sansanvi, and Samengalev to keep Lilith away from the baby. Now, I had to explain all that just to explain that Lilith is the Hebrew version of the vampire legend. And again, this isn't in the Bible, although there are some interesting elements where Lilith appears to show up in the Bible. For example, a lot of Bible scholars will tell you that the screech owl in Isaiah 34:14 is a reference to Lilith. Also, the terror that is by night, that's mentioned in the 91st Psalm, verse 5, is considered by some to be a reference to Lilith. And we got to understand something. These pagan deities that surrounded Israel, because remember, Paul tells us that the gods of the heathen are demons. So whether that god is Allah, or whether that god is Lilith, or whether it's Molech, or whatever, these are demonic powers. These are demonic strongholds. And there's this concept in the occult that's called an egregore. And an egregore is where a thought form, the little word literally means thought form. And when the thought form has energy pumped into it by people worshiping. So let's say, for example, I set up the god Bill. And there's this Bill up here, and he's like, we have this little statue, and we all worship Bill. Okay. After a while, this thought form, Bill, starts acquiring energy of its own. And ultimately, it gets enough energy that demons come and live in it. Or a strong man will come and live in it. And then it acquires a life of its own. And the more people down through the millennia that pay attention to this thing, that worship it, or even that fear it, the more energy this thing acquires. That's why, for example, when you have this deity, Allah, which is worshipped by 1 billion Muslims, that has a huge amount of power because it's been coming down for 1,400 years. That's when Islam was formed, about 1,400 years ago. So this is an enormous egregore. Now, the same thing is true to a lesser degree with something like Lilith, because Orthodox Jews, rabbinical Jews for 2,000 years or more have been fearful of this being, that she's going to come and steal their baby, kill their baby. And again, this gives the thing a life of its own. And that's why today, like there's actually a feminist magazine that's called Lilith. And some of you may have heard of Lilith Fair, which I think is some kind of either band or something or other that is dedicated again to this same archetype, this same goddess / demoness. Now, you'll find as you go through other cultures, down through the centuries, in every culture, there's the Lamia in ancient Greece, the Moroi in Romania. In Africa, the Ashanti have the Asan-Busan. In the Philippines, there was the Mandurugo. In India, the Bhuta. In the Americas, there was a Lugaru. Long before white men walked on this continent, there was a belief in people that could change shape, that could turn into animals and so on. Chile had the Pechuan, in Trinidad the Sucuyan, and of course even there's other cultures I don't even have time to get into. But the point is that this is like a universal archetypal thing. In Japan, this is actually a woodcut from hundreds of years ago of a being that visited women, the Nuke-Kubi, that visited women at night, was believed to drain their blood. Now, coming to Europe and America, the whole before the Middle Ages and in the Middle Ages and to this very day, vampirism was believed to be a reality in most of Europe. And my wife lived in Germany for several years back in the 60s, and she said it was totally commonplace. You walk by all these cute little, because she lived out in the country, these cute little cottages, and they'd all have garlic hanging around the doors. Just like, in this part of the country, you might, maybe someone might have a horseshoe over their door or something. Well, they just as sure as you expect that, you'd see garlic. And it's because garlic repels vampires, because garlic's a blood purifier. So, these people were deadly serious. They would not go out after dark unless they absolutely had to. And if they did, they'd wear plenty of crosses, So, and this is, within my lifetime. Now, back in the 18th century, there was what was known as a vampire panic that swept Europe. And they were digging up cemeteries and driving stakes through hearts of various dead people all over. This is in the history books. And some people believe it might have been partly because of the idea of people being buried alive, because that was a very real thing. I mean, you got to realize that embalming is a relatively recent phenomenon. And like 150, 200 years ago, it was not uncommon for people to be buried alive, which you can imagine is an incredibly horrible thing to happen. And they would like claw their way frantically, and if they were fortunate enough and strong enough, they would, punch their way through the coffin, dig their way up, and some poor guy would be walking through the cemetery. They'd see some person crawling out of their grave and go, "Ah, vampire!" And then they'd run and they'd drive a stake to the poor guy's heart after he went to all the trouble of digging his way out of the grave. I mean, this sounds bizarre, but this kind of stuff was happening. That's why in the 19th century, you can actually Google this, they would actually sell coffins with bells on them, where a person would be a little hole and a person could pull a little chain and the bell would ring. Oh my gosh, he's alive, and they, open up the coffin and let him out, So they think part of that was that. And of course, the fact that some people believe that these are, of course, hundreds of years ago, that some of it was due to the fact that they had what today we call serial killers, people who were deranged or demonized that would go around and kill a whole bunch of people in a village, and he's a vampire, and they drive a stake through his heart or cut off his head and fill his mouth with garlic, which is the accepted way of dispatching a vampire, is to drive a stake through their heart, cut off their head and fill their mouth with garlic. So now belief in this continued even through the, we all have this idea in our heads, well, if you're not a Bible believing Christian, you do that, everything got wonderful all of a sudden with the Age of Enlightenment. We had science. Everything got so wonderful, Not really, because even in the Age of Enlightenment, people totally believed in vampires. You may have heard of the great philosopher Voltaire, who was an author and a famous atheist. In fact, there's a story about Voltaire I love to tell. It has nothing to do with vampires. But believe it or not, he lived in a certain house in France, and he wrote that within 50 years, no one would believe the Bible. And this was in the Age of Enlightenment, which was the 1700s. And interestingly enough, the house where he wrote that today is the headquarters of the International Bible Society.
Wow.
So,
how cool is that?
This is what Voltaire wrote in his philosophical dictionary. Vampires are corpses who went out of their graves at night to suck the blood of the living, either from their throats or from their stomachs, after which they returned to the cemeteries. The persons so sucked, they waned, grew pale, and fell into consumption, while the sucking corpses grew fat, got rosy, and enjoyed an excellent appetite. It was in Poland, Hungary, Silesia, Moravia, Austria, and Lorraine that the dead made this good cheer. That's Voltaire, who was noted to be very enlightened and very smart and a total atheist. So even though he didn't believe in God, he believed in vampires. Okay, let's see. Also, even in New England. Now, we all know colonial New England was very much into the Puritans. You know, they were the dominant culture, the Pilgrims and the Puritans. They totally believed in vampires, in the reality of vampires.
Molly, you're rocking a tablet.
Now, some points we need to note at this time. More often than not, these vampires appeared to be women. But even though they were women, they were mostly regarded as disgusting and repulsive in appearance, semi-rotten corpses, etc., etc. Often their appearance was somewhat rat-like or rodent-like. There was nothing sexual or seductive about them, no matter what their gender. They were monsters. I mean, can you imagine waking up in the middle of the night and having a rotten corpse laying on top of you, drinking your blood? I mean, ew, you know, not fun. Not fun at all. Okay. More germane to our point this evening is what I call the fictional vampire, either from novels or from film. The vampire first appeared as a fictional character in the 18th century, with poems by such greats as Goethe and Samuel Taylor Coleridge and Lord Byron. The first vampire novel is credited to Lord Byron, who was a famous romantic poet. He wrote this novel, it was called The Vampire, in 1819, but it was probably actually written by his personal physician, whose name was Dr. John Polidori. Now, there's an interesting story here, because, you see, Lord Byron was a notorious libertine. In other words, he was a swinger. And he and his friend Percy Bysshe Shelley, though they were the two great poets of their day, and they were both profligates, they were both fornicators, they were both drug users. And in other words, they were kind of like, you know, hippies, except 150 years earlier. And Percy Bysshe Shelley married the daughter of a famous early feminist, Mary Wollstonecraft. And she was very young when he married her. I forget if she was like 15 or 16. Her name was Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley. Now, that name might ring a bell to some of you. If not, don't worry, I'll explain it in a minute. Now, because she was so young, this marriage was a huge scandal. And they were driven, both Lord Byron and Shelley were driven out of England by the authorities. They were not allowed to remain there. And so instead, they decided, oh, let's go and spend the summer in Switzerland. Because this guy was rich, you know, Lord Byron was very wealthy. And so he took his personal physician and Percy Bysshe Shelley and his young bride Mary to the Villa Diodati on Lake Geneva in Switzerland. Beautiful place. And this is what many people call the haunted summer of 1816. Because these people they set up shop in this villa and they do laudanum and they do opium and they'd have their little sex parties and all this stuff. Then he got rowing on the lake, and one night, Lord Byron got the idea. They were sitting around the campfire outside the villa, and they said, let's all make up a ghost story. And then in a week, we'll share it over the campfire in a week. Well, believe it or not, two very intriguing things emerged from that.
Shelley's Frankenstein, I bet, was one of them.
Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley sat down and wrote what would become the novel Frankenstein.
Bingo!
The most famous, probably horror character in history. Now, the irony of this is that how many of you have heard of Percy Bysshe Shelley, her husband?
Yeah.
Nobody. How many of you have heard of Frankenstein? I think everybody would raise their hand. And yet Percy Bysshe Shelley is considered this great poet who wrote Ode to a Skylark and all that kind of good stuff. And yet, who ends up being famous? His wife. Talk about every writer's nightmare, you know, because this guy had an ego the size of Montana anyhow. And for his wife to become a best-selling novelist while he languished in poverty was not real good for his ego. Additionally, this Dr. Polidori wrote a novel called The Vampire. And although Lord Byron stole it from him. But, and this has the first modern vampire character. The name of the character was Lord Ruthven, who was the vampire. He was kind of like the prototype, if you will, for Dracula, because he was a nobleman. He was suave. He was handsome. He was sophisticated. He wasn't a disgusting, rotting corpse. And so this kind of started the modern trend of what we call today the Gothic novel, the Gothic romantic novel. That was a whole period of literature in the middle to late 19th century. Then the next one was called, believe it or not, Varney the Vampire. Now that title don't really ring a bell for me personally, but that was the name of it. And then we have a new innovation in 1871 by a guy named Sheridan Le Fanu. There was a novel, Carmilla, which is about, you ready for this, a lesbian vampire. Then finally in 1897, the most influential vampire novel of history, Bram Stoker's novel, Dracula. Now what many of you may know, especially if you enjoy the History Channel or whatever, Dracula was based on a real dude. He was based on a Wallachian nobleman, or Warewolf, named Vladislav Basara, who was, Wallachia, I should explain, is a province within Transylvania. I'm sure you've all heard of, Transylvania. This is Transylvania. Transylvania is not England, Yeah, anyway, so he really did. You can go to this day and see Castle Dracula in Romania. And what many of you may not realize is that in this Vlad, his nickname was Vlad Stepesh. What does Stepesh mean? Well, his last name was Basara, but they call him Vlad Stepesh because what he would do is he would impale his enemies on stakes. I won't go into the details, but it wasn't pleasant. And the Stepesh means the impaler. So he was known as Vlad the Impaler. And he was so feared by the populace of his day that he, as an exercise in jurisprudence, he took his own personal silver drinking bottle and set it on the well in the center of the city and dared anybody to steal it. And it sat there for a week and nobody stole it. Because this guy was heavily into law and order, Vlad was. He was cruel, he was bloodthirsty, but to this day, the Romanian people regard him like, when we look at George Washington, as the father of their country. And they kind of resent the fact that most people in the world, all they know of Dracula is that he's this monster who runs around wearing a black satin cape and bites women in the neck. One other brief anecdote is that this Vlad received some emissaries from the Sultan. He was always fighting the Turks. I need to explain more about that in a minute. And they were Turkish emissaries, and they wore turbans. And they came into his presence because he was a prince. And they would refuse to remove their head coverings because, like many Muslims today, they believe in always keeping their heads covered. And he was very offended by that because normally if you walked into the presence of royalty, you took off your hat and said, okay, if you don't move your headgear, he ordered his guards to take and drive drive spikes into their heads, and he basically nailed their turbans to their heads, which of course killed them. And he sent them back to the Sultan in that state. Now, where he got the name Dracula, because it's actually pronounced Dracula, is his father was a member of the Order of the Dragon, which was actually a knightly order that was set up to defend Eastern Europe against the Turks, against the Muslims, against the Saracens. Excuse me. And so when his son was born, actually he had several sons, but Vlad ended up being the most ruthless and bloodthirsty, so he got to be on top. He was known as Dracula, which means son of the dragon. In Romanian, Dracul means dragon. So that's how he got the name Dracula. Anyway, so this guy was a real person, and this Bram Stoker who wrote the novel Dracula liked that idea and the whole backstory behind it, and so he made him. He read a novel called Land Beyond the Forest, which is what Transylvania means in Latin. Transylvania, like Pennsylvania means Penn's Forest, Transylvania means beyond the forest. And he learned about Dracula, and he thought, oh, that'd be a neat name for a character in a novel, and hence Dracula was born, so to speak, in its fictional form. Now, beyond that, in the 1950s and 60s, we began to see the emergence of vampire romance novels. The original one, and some of you may remember this TV show if you're old enough, there was this, believe it or not, there was a gothic soap opera on in the 60s called Dark Shadows. And it was kind of, languishing in the ratings and not real popular or anything. It was totally original because, as you probably know, most soap operas are about hospitals or people climbing in bed with each other or whatever. They have nothing to do with anything gothic. Well, this was about a haunted mansion in Collingswood up in New England. But the guy who produced the TV show got the idea, what if I put a vampire in it? So he had this vampire character, Barnabas Collins, and all of a sudden, phew, the ratings took off like crazy because women found this guy very sexy. There you see his picture, played by a Canadian actor named Jonathan Frid. And this was the first time that a vampire was portrayed as kind of a dark, tragic anti-hero, as opposed to a total monster. And this was the first gothic romance vampire novel. What's interesting is now that was in the 60s. Is that I'm not really into romance fiction. Pardon me, ladies. I know it's very popular among some women, but I can honestly say I've never read a romance novel. But I am told by people who are into this sort of thing that right now, if you go to any large bookstore, you will find that there are more romance novels about vampires than any other subject. They might have romance novels about Highlanders from Scotland, or they might have romance novels about pirates, or or noblemen, or whatever the case might be. But right now, it's like more than 2/3 of the books that are out there in the genre of vampire fiction, of romance fiction, are about vampires. So again, this shows how this whole thing has crept into the culture and has become obviously very successful. It is said that the romance genre among women is sort of the female equivalent of pornography for men, because it fulfills certain romantic desires for lonely women, all this stuff. I don't know if that's true or not, but I do know, to me, it's very worrisome. All of a sudden, it's being populated 2-to-1 in favor of vampires now in your local bookstore. Okay. Since that time, we have more and more of this showing up. Probably the next big example would be Anne Rice's series of books, The Vampire Chronicles, the most well-known of which was Interview with a Vampire, which also became a hit movie. And of all things, it starred Tom Cruise and Brad Pitt, who are two of the major heartthrobs in Hollywood, as two vampires in 18th, 19th century Louisiana and then Europe. So since that time, we've had all sorts of this stuff going on. And now, the most recent example are these Twilight novels, which are, again, targeted for young people, especially teen girls. It has been basically said that those novels are essentially targeting, 12 to 17-year-old girls. And I did wade through them, and yeah, they are. They definitely are. So here you have young, impressionable girls reading a novel about a girl just like them who develops, or we're going to talk more about this novel later, but crush on this 106-year-old vampire that looks like he's 17 years old. Okay. There you see, that's the poster from the first of the vampire films. And all of these things are showing vampires to basically be dark, romantic, but basically good. The kind of vampire you'd want to invite home to meet your mother. That kind of vampire. So, just don't serve him garlic, okay? All right. Now, in film, there's a similar evolution. The first notable vampire film was a silent film by a guy named F.W. Murnau in 1922. It was called Nosferatu. Nosferatu is a Romanian word for undead. And he wanted to call it Dracula, but the estate of Bram Stoker would not let him use the rights. So if you see the movie, and of course it's a silent film, it's like 80 years old, but it still stands up. It's got all the essential elements of a vampire film. It even has some special effects. And the guy that played the part of the vampire, Count Orlok, he couldn't be called Count Dracula because Bram Stoker's estate would have sued them. So he's called Count Orlok. he turns in an amazingly creepy performance. As you can see, he was repulsive. He had this really weird shovel-shaped face. He had like rodent teeth, ears that would make Mr. Spock totally jealous. And there's this one scene that just totally creeps you out to this very day where he rises from the coffin. What they did is they put a board behind him. And he's like this, out of the coffin like that. And this is 1922. I mean, that totally freaked people out. So anyway, this was the first cinematic vampire. And then the next thing that came along, of course, was there was a relatively unknown Hungarian actor named Bela Lugosi. And Lugosi was cast on the stage in the play Dracula. He was a natural because he was a native of Hungary. In fact, originally he didn't even speak English. He had to memorize his lines in English, even though he only spoke Hungarian. Of course, he had the famous Hungarian accent. And so many of the things that we now associate with Dracula, he had on the stage, and then later on they made a film out of it. And that film was just a huge success. And he was the first time we ever saw, now mind you, Bela Lugosi could not really be called handsome. As you can see from the picture there, he was kind of a menacing, dark-looking guy, but yet he was very continental, he was very smooth-looking, and he had a certain class, he had a certain presence. And of course, it didn't hurt that he, being from the stage, was shamelessly overacted, But that was how films were in those days. And people were literally fainting in the aisles of the theater. They were so terrified by this film. If you see it today, I mean, it's totally, but that's how much we deteriorated in our approach to horror in the last 50 years. So anyway, 50 years, more like 80 years. Anyway, he projected a very sophisticated vampire for the first time. Then the next big milestone was the Hammer Film Studio in England in the 1950s produced a series of color horror films. The first time horror films had ever done in color. And some of you may have seen these on TV or even in theaters if you're old enough. And their film Dracula in 1958 had Christopher Lee, who was very handsome. And he really had a very magnetic personality. And again, they were moving more in the direction of a good-looking, suave, debonair type figure. Then the next guy, and I call him the first matinee idol, was Frank Langella, an actor that's still around to this day. In fact, he was nominated for an Oscar for playing Nixon in that Frost-Nixon film. Anyhow, in 1979, he played Dracula after doing it on the stage. It was a huge hit. Many people say this is probably the most successful film portrayal of the Dracula novel. There are other versions I'm not going to spend a lot of time on. Most notably, Francis Ford Coppola, who did the Godfather series, which is considered by many the greatest film of all time. He did a version that was called Bram Stoker's Dracula, which is very artsy, very bloody, very perverse, but extraordinary film. And but the point I want to make through all of this is that gradually vampires have been more and more sexually appealing and tend to be portrayed more and more as anti-heroes or even heroes. And they're increasingly targeting young people, teen audiences. Now, I would submit to you that vampires are real, but not in the way you see in Hollywood. They don't have all of these powers, as I mentioned earlier, but there are really people out there that are into this thing. It is a kind of what is called in psychology a fetish, a sexual fetish. They get turned on by drinking one another's blood. And there's different classes of them, believe it or not. There's actually vampire churches, believe it or not. There's various websites you can get onto you can have vampire blogs, vampire chat rooms, all this stuff. And there's psychic vampires. There's vampires that are sanguinarians. That's the word they use. You have vegetarians, people who don't eat meat. Well, sanguinarians, sanguine is of course from the Latin word for blood. And these people actually drink blood. Now they don't like, bite people in the neck necessarily. They take, a scalpel, a razor blade, and it's all very clinical and it's all very clean. And they cut a vein somewhere and they drink each other's blood. And these people claim that this is the ultimate form of sexual intimacy, that it's better than sex, that they and their partner, and that there are nightclubs, just like there's, swingers clubs and homosexual clubs, there's vampire clubs in large cities where you can go and you can order a Bloody Mary, and it's really a Bloody Mary, and people go and they hook up with one another, and they drink each other's blood. Now this might sound totally bizarre to the average person, but yet this is a subculture, if you will, of a subculture. By that I mean, you may have seen or heard of the goth scene out there. These young people that they have black, makeup and wear black leather, and some of them have contact lenses that make their eyes look creepy, and they have spiky hair and they have piercings. This is called the goth movement or the goth scene. Well, a subculture within that goth scene is the vampire culture. And these people, in addition to liking to dress like that, they also like to drink one another's blood. And some of these people, like I watched about a month ago, a thing on, I think it was Discovery Channel, and the whole hour was devoted to these people. And they say, oh, well, we're born with a genetic deficiency. We don't have quite enough blood. And so we need to go, and this one lady says, oh, I was feeling tired all the time, and I was just walking around, and I took vitamins, and I went to my doctor, and I took pills, And then she says, I went and met this guy who was into blood drinking. We started drinking, and I felt wonderful. Now I feel great. We just drink each other's blood every day, and I feel great. This is like a variation on the I'm born homosexual, the homosexuals use. But they just say this is a genetic deficit. Some believe that by doing this, they will gain great power. They will gain great sexual power, something like that. Some believe that drinking blood will enable them to live forever. So there's all kinds of variations on this basic theme. There's also a strong correlation between the vampire scene and the fetish scene. And I won't get into too much of that because, fetishes are basically people who get turned on by clothing or by shoes or by some weird thing or other than the normal stuff that people get turned on by. But these people get turned on by blood. Now, many of these people are recruited through things like D&D. There are these fantasy role-playing card games. Magic the Gathering is one of the best known, but there's also one called Vampire Masquerade. And this has spawned a huge following. And again, most of the clientele of these card games are young people. And they get into this stuff, and before you know it, they think, well, gee, wouldn't it be cool to be a vampire? I mean, who would want that, right? And so they start going out and trying to find some way to become a vampire. And believe me, there's plenty of people that'll show them how. There's vampirechurch.com. There's thedarknessembrace.com. There's vampirerave.com, and probably you can Google many others. They're everywhere. As in everything else, there are also thousands of just isolated people out there doing this stuff. There's some guys that even are so desperate they cut themselves and drink their own blood. Anyway, now some people do engage in criminal behavior. One of the most famous ones was a guy in the last century before last, the famous vampire of Dusseldorf. And he would literally kill women and drink their blood. Not necessarily in that order. He'd probably drink their blood and then kill them. And he was caught and executed in Germany. So, and to this day, I have a friend out in Los Angeles who was in law enforcement. And you might think this is all kind of weird or whatever, but this is a cop talking. And he says, you would not believe in any given month how many homeless people we find in Los Angeles that have had the blood drained out of their neck and have been murdered. And he says, we cover it up, we call it something else because they're homeless, nobody claims them, nobody cares about them, unfortunately. But this is very real. This is very real. It may not be going on in Topeka, But it certainly is going on in large cities where people think they can get away with it more easily because there's millions of people, obviously, in Los Angeles. So almost all of these people are demonized to their eyeballs. I mean, because, we're going to talk more about this later, but God says you should not drink blood. And if you do something God says you shouldn't do, then you're going to open up a door. This is how it works. Just like if you go out and you commit fornication or adultery, you're opening up a doorway. Well, similarly, if you drink someone else's blood, you're getting all of the evil spirits that are in their soul coming into you, and vice versa. So just like I'm not fond of saying, but I have been known to say that demons are the ultimate venereal disease. Well, in the same way, you can pick up demons just as readily through practicing vampirism. Now, there are also significant health problems involved in all of this. I don't need to tell you, we've got HIV is still out there. There's all these blood-borne pathogens. Now, the vampire community was, oh, well, we get certificates from the person's doctor before we drink their blood. Yeah, right. I can just imagine meeting someone in a bar, like Club Dracula, and I'm not kidding. And could I see your certificate from your doctor that proves you don't have any blood-borne pathogens? Oh, sure. Here it is. Okay. I don't think it works like that. These people are compulsive. They're addicted to it. We'll talk more about this later. Blood is very addictive. It's worse than heroin. Okay, now, people ask, well, how do you become a vampire? Well, the legends out of Europe list several ways. One is if you're buried on ground that's not blessed by the church after you die. Now, I need to talk about this for a moment. See, some of you that may have been raised Catholic, you may have heard about incorruptibles. Incorruptibles are saints that, as a virtue of their great sanctity, quote unquote, their bodies are perfectly preserved after hundreds of years.
Yeah.
There are many of them throughout Europe, and they're like in glass, coffins in front of a church. You can go up there and you can see them. Now, whether this is for real, I don't know. I mean, I'm not saying you can open them up and poke the person and see if it's real or not. But they claim that certain saints, unfortunately, I think, don't quote me on this, I think Saint Bernadette, who was involved with the Lourdes apparition, is one of them. What's interesting is, in the Roman Catholic Church, this is regarded as a proof of great sanctity. But in the Eastern Church, the Orthodox Church, you may have heard of the Orthodox Church, it doesn't get a lot of press, but it's the Eastern branch of the church. They have a totally opposite view. They will say that if you find a person who's been buried and for whatever reason you dig them up and their bodies have not decomposed, it's because they are so evil that the earth has rejected them. Interesting.
Okay, I watched this ghost hunter show once, and they dug up a dog that had been sacrificed 20 years earlier. They found out where it was sacrificed for black magic. They dug the dog up, and it was still, it didn't rot. So I'm with the Orthodox Church on that one. Great evil, and you don't rot.
Absolutely opposite spin from the Latin rite, from Rome. And so the idea is that this is where vampires came from, because the Eastern European bloc, Romania was partly Orthodox, partly Roman Catholic. That area was more Russia, the Slavic nations, those were all Orthodox. And Ukraine, places like that. And so they had the idea that if your body is in the ground and you haven't decayed, it's because you're profoundly evil. So that's one way. Another way is if you're a heretic, if you've been excommunicated by the church, when you die, you become a vampire. If you kill yourself, if you're a suicide, see, again, all these things are the idea that heaven has rejected you. And I'm not, by the way, I'm not saying if you commit suicide that you're rejected by heaven. That's between the person who kills themselves and the Lord.
Well
But I'm
said.
just saying that's what was believed. So don't freak out if you have a loved one that took their own life. I'm not saying that. Then the other way is if you are killed by another vampire, or if you drink another vampire's blood, that will make you into a vampire. It spreads like a contagion, kind of like rabies. Now, in actual vampire cults, like the one I was in, what happens is you're initiated by a master, and the master drinks a lot of your blood. And then when you have virtually almost fainted from lack of blood, then he gashes open his chest or his wrist. And you see, this is all very weirdly, Christ-like. It's like kind of a twisted form of liturgical Christianity, because there's a very famous, what do I want to say, icon or religious painting where you see a pelican, and the pelican is gashing open its chest to feed its young. And that's a symbol of Christ, because his side was pierced, wrong side, I always had trouble with dyslexia, by a lance, and out comes the blood in the water. That's why I love John's Gospel. And it's from that blood that we are nourished, And so the metaphor that the vampire master gashed open his chest and you drink from his blood, it's like a counterfeit of being born again. And you believe that by doing that, you will live forever. And then what happens is after they put you in a coffin, you stay in the coffin for 3 days. When you emerge from the coffin, you are a living vampire. And they believe that when they die, whenever they die, it could be years, that they will rise again as an immortal undead and walk to live on the blood of the living. So that's the various ways that you can do it. Now, okay, I guess we already went through that. Sorry. As far as there being vampires or not, because I'm sure some of this is stretching credulity. Most Christians, if you were to go up and ask them before sitting here tonight, are there really vampires? Oh, no. It's just something Hollywood made up, or that was made up by, romantic Gothic novelists in the 19th century. Well, the most telling argument, I believe, is right from the Word of God. And I'm not referring to that passage out of Proverbs 30. In His Word, the Creator repeatedly tells us not drink blood. In every dispensation, for example, in Noah's day, if you go to Genesis 9, verse 4, right after the flood, basically, God tells Noah 2 things. You know what they are? Number 1, anybody who sheds innocent blood, his blood must be shed. This was the institution of human government. There was no government before Noah. But you have to have a government if you're going to have capital punishment. Amen? The other thing he said is, in chapter 9, verse 4, but the flesh with the life thereof, which is the blood thereof, shall ye not eat. Right there. Okay. Then, next covenant. In Moses' day, in Leviticus 17:10 through 12, we read, and whatsoever man there be of the house of Israel, and of the strangers that sojourn among you. So see, this even applies to non-Israelites. That eateth any manner of blood, I will even set my face against that soul that eateth blood, and I will cut him off from among his people. What does that mean? That means it's a capital crime to drink blood. That's how seriously Yahweh thought of this. To continue, for the life of the flesh is in the blood, and I have given it to you upon the altar to make an atonement for your souls. For it is the blood that maketh atonement for your souls. Therefore I said unto the children of Israel, no soul of you shall eat blood, neither shall any stranger that sojourneth among you eat blood. So this is very serious. I mean, if you're talking a death penalty, this is not just the Creator diddling around here. Then finally, see how the laws of 2 or 3 witnesses. Deuteronomy 12:23. Only be sure that thou eat not the blood. For the blood is the life, and thou mayest not eat the life with the flesh. Now, before we go any further, I want to say something, because everybody's freaking out. What about blood transfusion? Aren't you sure this is right? No. Notice it says eat blood. How many of you eat with a needle through your veins? I would submit to you that unless you're on IV because you're in a coma and you're getting like, sugar water through your veins, no. That isn't how we eat. We eat this way. We eat through our mouths. And people that practice vampirism in whatever form, they're drinking blood through their mouths. So this doesn't mean you can't have a blood transfusion. I don't really think it means that if you prick yourself, ooh, like that, you're damned forever. No. This is talking about a ritual act. Okay? Now, how about church? How about the church age? Well, in Acts 15, this is in the middle of the big discussion about what do we do with Gentiles that are joining the church. We know that the Jewish Christians, the Messianic believers, if you will, are not drinking blood. So, here's what it says at the ends of the Council of Jerusalem, Acts 15, 19 through 21. Wherefore my sentence is, that we trouble not them which are from among the Gentiles or turn to God, but we write unto them that they abstain from the pollutions of idols, no idolatry, from fornication, and from things strangled, and from blood. For Moses of old time hath in every synagogue them that preach him, being read in the synagogues every Sabbath day. Now, so Christians aren't supposed to drink blood either. So if any of you like blood sausage, better watch it. I know a lot of Germans like blood sausage. I'm part German. So you need to repent of that if you're doing it. Now, this kind of overarching prohibition can only be found in a relatively small number of instances, where it's in every dispensation. The reason for this is twofold. First of all, most of the pagan cultures surrounding Israel had some sort of cultic blood-drinking rituals. Some of them believed their gods lived on blood. Additionally, blood consumption in any quantity can be highly addictive, much more so than heroin. And I can testify this from my own experience.
Right.
Remember, the blood is the life, Deuteronomy 12:23. In fact, oddly enough, that very quote is in Dracula, the novel. There's a character.
It's not more addictive than heroin. How many blood addicts do you see robbing blood banks? Yeah, it's not as addictive as heroin. That's ridiculous.
Who's crazy named Renfield, and he's going, the blood is the life, the blood is the life, the blood is the life. He's a disciple of Dracula. And so realize that this stuff is deadly serious, because again, Yahweh is not going to go around and spend all of this ink, so to speak, in his word, forbidding people from doing something. It's a fantasy. It's like, I am forbidding you from being Tinkerbell. No. And yet that's what most Christians think vampires are. They're like Tinkerbell. They're like Peter Pan. They're like the Tooth Fairy. Now, let's talk for a minute about vampires and spiritual warfare. Believe it or not, I've had many people call me over the years. You don't believe the phone calls I get. And I'm blessed to be able to help Christians within the body about people who are being attacked by vampires. Vampires come to them in their sleep and are draining their blood, usually women. And I tell them, hey, there is nothing special about a vampire. Just like any other creature of darkness, they must flee if you use the blood in the name of Yeshua. And, don't be afraid of this stuff. I mean, you have the authority. And I've talked about this before, but I'll say it again. And someone will say, well, I've tried that, and it isn't working. They're still coming. I said, well, if at first you don't succeed, read the directions. St. Paul says in Corinthians that women should have a covering on their head for the sake of the angels. Now, realize that in order to be a fallen angel, you must drink human blood. How many of you knew that? Yeah, that's what makes an angel fall. See, angels are tempted by human female beauty. They find you ladies incredibly attractive. And in order for them to be able, because normally angels are asexual beings, I think we know that. But in order to be able to function sexually, they have to drink human blood. The tempter is there. Satan, who himself is a fallen cherub, is whispering in their ear, drink human blood, and it will give you the power to fulfill your dark desires. And so the angel drinks human blood, and just like that, his celestial nature, like that, becomes totally dark, totally twisted, totally evil. He also loses all of his angelic powers, but he still has his angelic intellect. Unfortunately, that is not taken because angels are very smart. And so a lot of these people that are being visited by vampires are being visited by fallen angels, especially if they're women. So in every case that I've had this happen, I tell them, try going to bed with a nightcap. And I don't mean the kind you drink. I mean the kind, and you know what? Immediately, these visitations stop. Why? So first you don't succeed, read the directions. Okay. Additionally, there is a unique quirk in the vampire playbook, which I'm going to share with you. If you watch some horror movies, you may know this, but this is actually true because it's based on a scriptural principle. And here is the quirk. A vampire cannot enter your dwelling without being invited. Seriously. And if you've invited him or her, you can rescind the invitation in the name of Yeshua the Messiah.
Wow.
Simple as that. And he can no longer, or she can no longer enter your dwelling. Now, this only applies to private dwellings. It doesn't apply to like a church building or a public forum of any sort. So if all else fails, just take back the invitation in Yeshua's name. This is based upon the biblical idea that temptation must be entered into voluntarily. Amen? I mean, the devil can tempt you until his lips fall, but at some point, you have to give in. And if you don't, then you're cool. You know? So that's the basis of this whole concept. But it's actually true. So just bear that in mind. Okay, moving on to part 2. How about the werewolves? Are werewolves real? Now, this might, bake your noodle a little, but yes, they are real. Though the underdog, pardon the pun, in the monster hierarchy, there is actually more evidence for werewolves existing exactly as they are seen in Hollywood movies. Think about that. That there's technical terms for these. They're either a lycanthrope or a theriomorph. See, I got to show off here a little. I have a college degree. Lycanthrope comes from 2 words. Lucan in Greek means wolf, and anthrope means man. A theriomorph is a broader term. Therios is the Greek word for beast. Like if you were to read in the book of Revelations, in the Greek, it would be to megatherion, the great beast. And morph, of course, we all know that means to change. So a theriomorph is someone who can change into a beast of whatever sort, because it ain't just werewolves. It can be, were whatever. But werewolves are the most popular because of the savage intellectual cunning of the species Canis lupus. I don't know if any of you have any kind of intimate knowledge of wolves, but they're amazing creatures. They are amazing creatures. They're extremely smart, extremely powerful. And their nose, believe it or not, a typical wolf's nose is 100 times better than the best bloodhound. They can they could find one person in the city of New York, just like that. So,
Hey, Jay, good to see you,
anyway,
mate.
this goes way back to the dawn of human history. You can, in fact, go into caves in Europe and other places, and you'll find drawings that go back to before the bud of time of men with wolf's heads, men with antlers, men with various other animal appurtenances. And some of this is rooted in the idea of shamanism. I don't know if you've heard of the word shaman. It's very trendy right now if you're into the New Age movement. But shamans are what we used to call witch doctors. And I'm sure you've all seen movies of like Native Americans, and they're wearing like buffalo heads, or like, I don't know, when I lived in Seattle in the Pacific Northwest, you would see Native American dances, and they wear like a raven head, or even a head that represented a killer whale, or something like that. Well, there's this idea that by wearing these things, you assume the character and the power and the nobility of the animal. And if you talk to these shamans, they will say, oh yeah, we can actually turn into a killer whale. We can turn into a wolf. We can turn into a raven. And you might say, yeah, right, that's just, old Injun Joe has been drinking too much firewater. Well, no, it's not quite that simple. Because, see, I'll tell you a true story.
He'd get in trouble for saying that now. The Indians are drinking too much firewater. You can't say that, Bill.
An old friend of mine, Dr. Chuck Swigert, no relation to Jimmy Swigert, spelled it in there. He's a pediatrician, spirit-filled man, and he was doing pro bono work on a Native American reservation in the Pacific Northwest. He'd go there every week and look at the kids, give them checkups, whatnot, take care of their illnesses. And every week, he'd drive out at the end of the day, and there'd be this old, wizened up Indian woman wrapped in a blanket. And she'd just be glowering at him. I mean, like, if looks could kill, he would have been dead, and his car would have died. She's just glowering at him. Whatever, So week after week, this would happen. And then one day he was driving out of the, again, this is a guy, he's a doctor, this isn't a flake. And he's driving out, and this lady's standing there, and he said, literally, in the blink of an eye, 1 minute she was there, like that, there's this giant raven standing there. And she was gone, that fast. And then the raven flew away.
No way!
Now, that's called a skinwalker. That's what Native Americans call it. They can turn into wolves, they can turn into coyotes, they can turn into various other animals.
Wow.
So this stuff is very real. Let's see, in ancient Egypt, and again, we're talking 3,000 years ago, we see all these portrayals of beings. I'm sure, again, you've seen these on TV with hawk heads, with crocodile heads, with jackal heads, like Anubis is a jackal-headed god, the falcon-headed god Horus. What's this stuff talking about? Where is this coming from? Some of you may have heard of Petronius. He was a Greek author, contemporary of St. Paul's. And basically, he talked about werewolves in his novel, The Satyricon. And he is the first guy to associate them with the full moon. I'm sure most of you have heard the part of the legend that says, and this is from the werewolf film with Lon Chaney Jr., even a boy who is good and says his prayers at night can become a werewolf when the moon turns bright. That's Maria Ustinskaya, the old gypsy. And that isn't really true. The moon, you see, has a long association with evil. And why do you think that is?
Good question.
Just real quickly, I'll share this. It has nothing to do with werewolves. The moon is a symbol of the church. Look at some of the references in the Bible about the moon. Think about it. The moon has no light of its own. It gets its light from what? The sun. Christ is the sun of righteousness. And the moon is imperfect. It has a pockmarked face. That's why we all, there's the man in the moon, Just like the church. is an imperfect image of the Son, of the Son of God. Also, what happens when you have a lunar eclipse? The moon goes dark. Why? Because the world gets between the moon and the sun. Just like a Christian goes dark when the world gets between Christ and the Christian. Just a little mini teaching there. Anyway, so that isn't really based in anything. The idea that werewolves can actually turn into a werewolf anytime they want. The term itself comes from the Old English were, which means man, and wolf, which obviously means wolf. During the Middle Ages, there were many widespread outbreaks of werewolf attacks. And some of this, many people believe, relates to what we today call rabies. That someone would be bitten by a rabid animal, maybe even a wolf or a dog. And, you know, back then, again, these are primitive times, they'd go be, you know, frothing at the mouth and crazy and, you know, whatnot. And then, oh, it's a werewolf, you know. So some of this may very well have been, you know, superstition or whatever. Now, werewolves are larger and stronger than either humans or wolves. So they're like the best and the worst of both species come together. And
hey, Barry, good to see
they
ya.
lose most of their humanity when they turn and develop a ravenous appetite for flesh. Though commonly thought today that you become a werewolf by being bitten by one, this is actually a relatively modern idea. There's actually, believe it or not, a medical condition known as clinical lycanthropy. There are people locked up in mental hospitals today that believe they are wolves. They walk around on all fours, they defecate like animals, they growl, they howl at the moon. And there's also another condition that's called hyperhirsutism. That's a big word. It means basically super hairy. And these are people, usually men, thank goodness, that are really, really, really hairy. I mean, you know, like beyond hairy. And some people think that this might also have been some of the werewolves, because these guys look like apes. They're so hairy. So anyhow, that is some of the origins of these things. Then you have in literature, now this is much spottier. There aren't as many novels and things about the werewolf as there are about the vampire. Herodotus wrote about a tribe called the Nerui. This is 400 BC, that they turn into wolves every 9 years. Ovid talked of men who roamed the woods of Arcadia transforming into wolves in his book Metamorphosis. Interesting name, Metamorphosis. And I already mentioned Petronius' Satyricon, but they haven't gotten a lot of press compared to the vampire. When they look at werewolves in films, it's a little bit punier than the vampire cinema. In fact, it's interesting, you may not know this, but there are the only figure in literature or film who has had more stuff made about him than Dracula is Sherlock Holmes. He's the most popular literary character in history. Dracula's number 2. Werewolves are somewhere further down. But the very first werewolf film was Werewolf of London in 1935. Then the most famous one was The Wolfman with Lon Chaney Jr. That was in 1941. And then there were a few not so notable ones. But then there were the Howling films in 1981 and the sequels. And it's interesting to note that in the Howling film, the original one, that's the first time they ever really showed what a werewolf actually looks like. Because prior to that, like if you see the Wolfman with Lon Chaney, it's a very anthropomorphic wolf. In other words, it basically looks like a guy with a furry mask on. It isn't very impressive, although back then they were very scared by it because, you know, they were much more innocent. In the 1940s, they'd only seen Hitler. But nowadays, the werewolves look a lot more real. They look a lot more like werewolves really look. And some of you may have heard this story, but I was told by colleagues in the Brotherhood of Satan that when you see the transformation in the movie The Howling, which is sort of like about 2/3, 3/4 of the way through the movie, of this one character who actually turns into a werewolf on camera, that it's actually a real guy turning into a werewolf. because they couldn't get the makeup ready in time. I don't know if that's true or not, but it's interesting because if you watch that film, it will give you an idea of what werewolves really look like, because they are extremely scary, unless, of course, you have the blood of the lamb on your side. Let's see. Then in the same year was also an American Werewolf in London. Probably the most big screen actor type character ever play a werewolf was Jack Nicholson, who was arguably a huge Hollywood star. He starred in 1994 with Michelle Pfeiffer in the movie Wolf. And the Harry Potter films, which are, of course, very popular. A werewolf figures prominently as a hero in the Harry Potter books and films. Then, after the turn of the millennium, we had the Underworld trilogy. As so far, there's been 3 of them, which is about a supposed war between werewolves and vampires. The storyline is that werewolves are supposed to serve vampires, but they rebel. That's actually total nonsense in reality, but that's another story. Then the Twilight Saga, which is about, we've discussed it before in this talk, this teenage love affair between a human teenage girl named Bella and a 100-and-some-year-old vampire boy named Edward Cullen. There's also werewolves in that. In fact, it's interesting. If you go into Burger King, for example, which I don't recommend, but if you do, to eat lunch, you'll find they have placemats, and they offer these gift cards where you can have Team Jacob or Team Bella or Team Edward, all relating to these movies. And Jacob is a Native American werewolf, and Edward is the vampire, and Bella is the human girl. And so there's all these teenage girls out there rooting for Edward, and there's all these other teenage girls out there rooting for the hunky Native American werewolf. And in the movies and in the books, the werewolves are portrayed as just human beings that just sort of, through Hollywood special effects, into this enormous wolf that's bigger than a Kodiak bear. So that's not really accurate either. But again, we have a werewolf for the first time as a hero, as a sympathetic character. And I actually sat down and read all 4 of the Twilight novels, and he ends up being quite a hero. In fact, all the werewolves become heroes in the Twilight books. So then, of course, I think within a month or 2, they're coming out with a remake of The Wolfman, starring, again, big star Anthony Hopkins, who also played Hannibal Lecter, and then as the werewolf, Benicio del Toro. So, anyhow, in reality, I'll tell you, this picture, I'm going back one here, looks very much like a real werewolf. And I've seen a real werewolf. They are very imposing. Only high-level Satanists are gifted with this anointing. You can't, it's not like in the movies where if you are bitten by a werewolf.
Wow, they call it an anointing. Wow.
You become a werewolf. It's not that simple at all. In fact, you don't want to know how you become a werewolf. It's not fit for innocent ears, but it's so horrifying and depraved, I don't even want to go into it.
Wow.
But you see, in the Brotherhood, there are 10 degrees. Like, first degree, second degree, third degree. These are grades of achievement. And when you get up to 7th degree, you become what is called an adeptus exemptus, which means you're an adept, at least someone who's very good at doing something, and exempt means you're beyond morality. You're exempt from good and evil at that point. You become an embryonic god in human form. At this point, there is a fork you have to take in the road in this particular flavor of Satanism that I was in. One way is to become a vampire, one way is to become a werewolf. I chose the way to become a vampire because I thought it was sexier somehow, and I heard becoming a werewolf was extremely painful. And indeed it is. You can hear the bones crack. So I decided it would be less painful to be a vampire. Anyway, true werewolves function as guards or assassins for the Brotherhood. A real werewolf is between 7 and 8 feet tall, weighs somewhere between 300 or 400 pounds, and they're extremely formidable. I'm going to tell you several true stories about werewolves. The first one was when we were out in Seattle in ministry. a child was brought to us for ministry. And he'd really been through something. See, Satanists love to do their rituals outdoors at night if they possibly can. And they love doing them in places of corruption, in places of evil fetid smells. So they love dumps. They love landfills. And there was a particular place where they had these methane flames coming up, from the gases of the stuff decomposing. I mean, a very, very hellish place, both the flames at night and, of course, the stench. And so these two kids, one of whom had sitting in front of us, were bicycling around after dark in this landfill, which wasn't a real smart thing to be doing, but you know how kids are. And anyway, they came upon this circle, and there were these people in black robes, and they were sacrificing something. They couldn't tell what it was, which is probably just as well. And they totally freaked. You got, black robes, flames, the whole bit. It was obviously something they'd seen enough TV and, this is something satanic, And so they both hightailed it. They had those little kids, I don't know if they still have them or not, but with the banana seats and all that. And all of a sudden, this kid said they heard something go boom, 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 coming behind them. And he looked around, and all he could see was this giant shape that was just towering over glaring eyes. And it was the strides this thing was taking were enormous. And this kid was in the lead, and his friend was behind him. And boom, boom, and the ground was literally shaking under this thing. And all of a sudden, he heard his little friend go, like that, And he looked back, and his friend wasn't there anymore. And this thing was still coming, boom, boom, boom. And the kid said that this giant hand, 5-fingered hand with talons on it that just wouldn't quit, came around and grabbed him by the chest. And he says, "Oh, Jesus!" And just like that, the thing, like he was scalded, this giant, whatever it was, let go, fell back like someone had kicked him in the teeth. Wow. And the kid pedaled home like the devil was after him, as you might imagine.
Wow, that's crazy.
He had to have like 30-some stitches. There was these marks like here, 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 and here on his little chest. He was like, I'd say 10 or 12 years old, I forget for sure. And of course,
guys, these are little details you don't make up. I believe this guy.
The police went up there, they found nothing. But, that's what you expect, because these folks are really good at cleaning up what they do. The other kid was never found, and he was probably lunch for that thing. And that's an example, one of the ways that they can function as watchdogs, so to speak, for the Brotherhood. When they're having a ritual or do something else important or sensitive, they're keeping a lookout because they have enormously good senses of smell. The other thing is that they're assassins. They can kill somebody and, it's a wild animal attack, because that's what it looks like. It looks like someone was mauled by a grizzly bear, because they can literally rip the head off somebody as easy as you would pull apart a wishbone. The other thing that happened was we had a lady come to us for ministry, sweet little woman. Her husband her ex-husband, I should say, was a Mormon bishop who lived right up the mountain from where we lived. This is so funny. He lived on Cougar Mountain. And this is near Issaquah, which is a suburb of Seattle. And she told us that she felt she needed deliverance. And she was a Christian. And I said, well, why is that? And she says, well, for one thing, my ex-husband's a Mormon. But for another thing, the last time we had sex, he had dragged me down the stairs by my feet to the basement of our home, pushed a door, a button, and a secret part of the basement opened up. There was this satanic altar in there. There were all these people in there. He threw on the altar, they tied her up, and he turned right before our eyes into a werewolf. By the way, this guy was an airline pilot by profession. So just think, next time you're flying, your pilot might be a werewolf. Anyway, and he proceeded to rape her as a werewolf, and she had the scars to prove it. And she felt that because of something that profoundly evil, she needed deliverance, more so than just from being married to some typical Mormon guy. And she lived in mortal fear of this guy. In fact, she wouldn't come. We were working out of Saints Alive ministry at that time, Saints Alive in Jesus. And at that time, it had a little parsonage right at the foot of this Cougar Mountain. And she wouldn't even come that near. We had to go to a church in Redmond, Washington, which is like probably 10, 15 miles from there, in order to minister to her. She wouldn't get that because she was so terrified of this ex-husband. And I could see why. Now, this happened to my dear wife and her sister. We just moved to this very same place in 1987. I was going to become a full-time minister with this. It was an evangelistic organization that witnessed to Mormons. And I had gone to a conference in Utah to speak. And so my wife and her sister were there. And we were only in that building a couple of months, and they hadn't even bothered to put a lock on the door because it was out in the middle of nowhere. I mean, it was like out in the country, you know, so there's no lock. And we were living in this split-level house. And down below us was another guy that worked in the ministry. And so all of a sudden, the first night I was gone, naturally I was gone, they heard this boom outside. And they started praying, you know, what's going on, you know. And my wife ran down the stairs to lock it. The door wouldn't lock. And so they did the thing like you see in the movies, they rammed a chair into the door, you know, just to try and keep it shut. And they looked out the living room window, and there it was, looking at them back. And this is from a second-story window. And it was a werewolf, just like you saw in that picture. It was like, you know, 7 or 8 feet tall, big, looks like, you know, Arnold Schwarzenegger with steroids and fur. And just the growl shook the house. And they were praying, and they were pleading the blood. This thing could not cross the blood. It could not, even though the house was totally defenseless in the natural, it could not cross the blood of the lamb. It could not get in that house. And it was, you know, pacing back like a caged animal, you know, which was good because we got footprints. And the foot was this big. And there was like 3 balls here the size of softballs, 1 ball here. Just like a super elongated wolf print. And people have asked me, well, do you think that's what Bigfoot is? No, Bigfoot's something else. But I think maybe sometimes that if these things are sighted in the woods or whatever, it might be mistaken.
Hey, Voss, good to see ya.
But as I understand, I'm not an authority on Bigfoot like I am about werewolves and vampires, as I understand.
Yeah, Voss, he just done his vampire stuff. Now he's starting the werewolf stuff.
That Bigfoot, basically, they have 5 toes, just like an ape or a human being, but they're just enormous. And anyhow, I was taken to the vet to figure out what the heck was. We took plaster of Paris, is that it? Footprint casts of it. He said, whatever this thing was, it was well over 350 pounds. And its stride, he said, indicated it was 8 feet tall. And he said, I've never seen anything like this, ever, ever, ever. And the funny thing was, is this happened before. We had a thing happen with a little lady who had the werewolf airline pilot husband. And we wondered maybe that was him.
Where is he, Doy?
Checking us out. Because, of course, you know, he was a Mormon. He was a bishop in a Mormon church. And maybe he was sent down to do us in. Because, I mean, at that time, Ed Decker, who was running that ministry, was like regarded as the leading anti-Mormon in the world. I mean, he was like, they thought of him as the Antichrist, you know. So anyhow, so this stuff is real. I'm not saying that there's, you know, werewolves on every street corner. No, I'm not. But I am saying that they are wherever they are needed by the brotherhood for whatever reason. And again, don't let Hollywood fool you. They aren't just confined to the new moon. They can turn anytime they want to turn. Although normally they will never do it in daylight because there's too much danger of being seen. But one thing about Hollywood is true. They fear silver. Now you might ask, why silver? Well, first of all, on a chemical level, silver is an antibacteriological agent. Some of you may take colloidal silver as a health remedy.
Wow, he's pretty thorough. Now we're going to understand why silver's not good for him. I knew silver could help you because there's some sort of silver they do with the vax, not the vax, the COVID.
But beyond that, silver in the Bible is a symbol of redemption. You know,
I never knew
Yeshua was
that.
betrayed for 30 pieces of silver. And I don't know if you know this, but the tabernacle was built on silver. The foundation of the tabernacle was all made out of silver fittings. I mean, the boards were whatever, acacia, whatever it was, but the fittings are all silver. And so the idea is that silver is a symbol of the redemption of Christ. And so naturally, something that profoundly evil would, because believe me, you have to be like, have more demons per cubic centimeter than the entire city of San Francisco to be a werewolf or a vampire. You've got to be pretty bad off because the amount of demonic power it takes to make those transformations. And you might say, well, this just sounds too bizarre. Well, you don't know the power of the devil, number one. And you don't even know the power of the human body, number two.
Guys, are you buying him? I'm actually believing his testimony here. He's got way too much detail and he's not making it too arty-farty. He's explaining it quite rational. I'm actually believing this guy.
I'll just illustrate with a couple of things here. Number one, remember when I am quote unquote glorifying the devil, remember compared to the Lord, he's a punk. He is like a gnat next to the Almighty God. So I'm not trying to scare you. I'm not trying to glorify the devil, but I just want you to understand that there are amazing things that can be done. We had a lady that I was working with in a secular setting. I was working as a drug counselor, and she was a drug addict and also a gambling addict, profound mental health issues. And she would have to be admitted almost every week to the mental ward at our local hospital. And they would have to put her in restraints, either a straitjacket or whatever. And when she was in restraints, she would have huge gashes appear on her back. Huge, enormous gashes. When she was totally leather straps, arms and feet. I mean, her bed was soaked with blood. There's no explanation for that in the natural realm. We did a deliverance on her, and that didn't even help.
Wow.
That's what's called in psychology, big word, sorry, somaticization. See, this poor woman, when she was a child, anytime she did anything wrong, her parents would tie her up backwards to her little rocking chair in the nude and whip her with rubber hoses.
What?
And that's just unspeakably horrible. But she carried that with her. And whenever she felt the least bit guilty, that's how it would manifest. And that's just the power of the human mind. When we used to be into witchcraft, my wife and I were both master hypnotists. And we could take somebody, hypnotize them, and we could take a pencil and say, this is a red hot poker, touch it to their hand and raise a 3rd-degree burn on their hand. Just
wow,
like
physical burn.
See, that's the power of the mind. Now, bring in the power.
And you know what, guys? I believe that because I had a dream once. You know how I'm an ex-drug addict. I had a dream once I was having a shot of speed, and where I had the shot in my dream, that got a little rash come up on my arm. So, yeah.
For the demonic. And, like, how do you account for this thing where this very prestigious doctor saw a woman standing there 1 second and the next second a raven that was 1/10 of her size?
Mm.
I mean, that's pure satanic power. So don't immediately discount this stuff.
The whole movie, The Black Panther, is based on this shapeshifting stuff.
Especially when it's in the Bible. Okay. You go to Daniel chapter 4. Some of you already know what I'm talking about, perhaps. In Daniel chapter 4, verses 14 through 16, it's talking about a watcher and a holy one. It says, he cried aloud. And this is about in the book of Nezer. And he said thus, hew down the tree, cut off his branches, shake off his leaves, and scatter his fruit. Let the beast get away from it, and the fowls from his branches. Nevertheless, leave a stump in the roots in the earth, even of the band of iron and brass and the tender grass of the field. Let it be wet with the dew of heaven, and let his portion, meaning the king, be with the beasts of the grass of the earth. Let his heart be changed from man's, and let a beast's heart be given to him, and let 7 times pass over him. Now later on, the king does not repent. That was a dream that Daniel interpreted for him. So he doesn't. His heart is still lifted up, and he is glorifying and boasting. And so in verse 33 of the same passage, it says, "The same hour was the thing fulfilled upon Nebuchadnezzar. He was driven from men, and did eat grass as oxen, and his belly was wet with the dew of heaven, till his hairs were grown like eagle's feathers, and his nails like bird claws." Now, what the heck is that? I'm not saying it's necessarily a werewolf, but it is definite. It says that he was given the heart of a beast. And it says that his nails grew like the talons of a bird, and it sounds like he turned into a werebird. Now that sounds kind of weird, but hey, the guy that initiated me and made me a Gnostic Catholic bishop was a were tarantula. So why not a werebird? Now, nobody knows for sure what that's all about, that passage. That's one of those passages that you have to, kind of say, okay, Lord, that's something you're going to have to explain to me when I get up to glory. But I would submit to you that and it's interesting because one of the ways that someone can become a werewolf in folklore is if they blaspheme God. In medieval Europe, it was believed that if someone blasphemed the Lord, that they would be smitten by him with the curse of becoming a lycanthrope. So maybe that's what happened here. I don't know. But I would just say to you, there's enough room here for interpretation to not just totally shut your mind out to this. And remember, the consummate satanic virtue was pride. Now, there's a phenomenon within Satanism that's called atavistic resurgence. Now, what does that mean? Well, an atavism is a throwback. If, like, you were overnight turning into a caveman or a cavewoman, that would be an atavism. This is considered a good thing in Satanism. There was a Satanist in the early part of the last century called Austin Osman Spare, and he came up with a doctrine of atavistic resurgence, which is you should try and reclaim the beast part of yourself. You should try and become a beast. You should literally try and transform yourself into a beast. And who would make these elaborate artistic talismans? This guy is uber creepy. And this guy makes Aleister Crowley look like a Sunday school teacher. And he was the originator of this doctrine. Now, in 1966, a key year, that was the year that Anton Szandor LaVey founded the Church of Satan. And one of the first things he did was resurrect this doctrine of atavistic resurgence. In the Satanic Bible, which he wrote.
And Anton LaVey, on his deathbed, said, "Oh my, what have I done? There's something dreadfully wrong." And his priestess, who was with him as he was dying, she turned to Christianity because of that. So Anton LaVey said, "Oh my, there's something dreadfully wrong." Yeah, you bet. You wrote the Satan Bible, mate.
Evil books you'll ever read. He says that man is a beast, no better and often worse than the four-footed variety. And so therefore we should embrace our beastliness. We should become gentlemen and lady beasts. And in fact, you can actually see pictures. He designed satanic rituals where people would actually put on the head of a plaster mache head of a pig, or a head of a wolf, or a head of a crocodile, or whatever, and they would actually crawl around on all fours and defecate like an animal and growl at each other and just do really bizarre stuff. I don't even want to.
Hey, not going to say, mate.
Bring out the beast within them. Satanists of most stripe to this very day are encouraged to do this very kind of thing. And becoming a werewolf is considered the ultimate achievement in that. So, yes, werewolves are real. They're not common, but they're out there. And don't be afraid of them. I'll tell you one more story. I can't tell you this is not firsthand, but a lady I respect very much told me about this. She said that a couple of deacons in a church in Southern California got to talking to this big biker, Hell's Angel. And you probably know most Hell's Angels are Satanists, duh. Anyway, and that might be the nicest thing that they are. Anyhow, and they actually led this guy to the Lord. And they said, well, with all the stuff you've been into, all the fornicating and adultery and dope and whatever, and I also murdered 8 guys. Well, maybe you need to, get some deliverance, and then we'll turn you over to the sheriff. So they said, well, we got this little old lady in our church, and she's mighty in the Lord, and she'll help us do deliverance on you. So they took him to this little old lady who had this little cottage out in the edge of town. And they sat him on the nice little chintz sofa, which kind of creaked under his weight. I mean, this guy was huge, like 250 pounds, and was all muscle. And they said, would you help us? They explained, we led this guy to the Lord, but he's done all this stuff, and we think he needs some deliverance, and then we'll turn him over to the sheriff. And he's pretty willing to go to the sheriff and get his punishment for all of his crimes. He said, okay. So the first thing these guys do is we command you in the name of Jesus, any demon that's inside of you to manifest. Big no-no. Major no-no. Well, anyhow, this guy was, and he starts turning into a werewolf, like literally in 60 seconds. He hulks out. And all of a sudden, there's this 8-foot werewolf standing in this woman's living room. And these guys just go, ah! And they literally jump out the window. They're so terrified. And this little old 90-pound, 80-year-old lady is sitting there in a rocking chair, looking at this giant werewolf, like that. And she goes, Satan, you stop that in the name of Jesus. And that fast, there's this like 3/4 naked giant biker sitting on the sofa again. But he was so freaked out.
See, if you're really from God, the demons will leave straight away. That's why these exorcists, Catholic exorcists, if they are really from God, the demons would leave the body straight away.
And out the door and was never seen again. That is supposedly a true story. And I just say that to indicate that as bizarre and as scary as these things sound, and as scary as they might appear to be in the movies, it doesn't take a silver bullet to stop a werewolf. It just takes the name which is above every other name.
Wow.
So I don't want to put fear in your heart about this. The only thing I want you to be fearful of is what's going on when our young people start idolizing these things, start having posters of them. I mean, you wouldn't believe it. You can go online now and you can get shower curtains with Edward Cullen, the teenage vampire from Twilight's picture, giant, like this big on your shower curtain. You can get him on your underwear. You can get him anywhere. This guy is the most popular, sexy vampire in history.
I do a joke that Tricky's got bed sheets of Edward Cullen's face, but he's not here, so I better not do that joke.
Now, we're going to look at this novel a little bit. It's important to understand that the church, some churches, are using these books with their youth group, as I mentioned at the beginning of this talk. To me, this is quite bizarre. But you know why? Well, here's 2 factors. Number 1, in the plot line, Bella, who's the heroine of the novel, she's this teenage girl, and I won't tell you the whole plot because it would take too long, but essentially she's this only child whose mother has been divorced, and she's traveling around with her baseball player new husband, and so she's come to live with her sheriff father in this little town of Forks, Washington, which just happens to be the town that has the most rainfall of any city in America. And believe me, there is really a town of Forks. It's now become Vampire Central, by the way, thanks to her books. But anyway, the Olympic Peninsula is a temperate rainforest, so it gets an amazing amount of rain. So anyhow, she meets this guy, and there's chemistry, as they say, Edward, and it turns out he's a 110, 105-year-old vampire, I forget which. but he looks like he's 17 because the stick of vampirism is at whatever age you were turned into a vampire, you're stuck there. Like an Interview with a Vampire, the two vampires in that story actually turned, I forget what age, a 6 or 7-year-old girl into a vampire. And so she's this creepy little 7-year-old girl that murders people. And at one point, she gets so tired of her long hair, she cuts it because she thinks it would make her look older if she had short hair, and it grows back instantly. Because everything, when you're a vampire, supposedly heals instantly, including your haircut. So anyway, they get together, passionately fall in love, but they wait until marriage. So it's pro-chastity. The other thing is after they marry, she gets pregnant in this dismayingly short amount of time. The baby is like growing like this because it's a half vampire, half human baby. And everybody's worried that it's going to be a monster and that it will kill her. And so they want her to abort the baby. And she won't do it. So it's pro-life. And because of those two messages, these things are being pushed in some Christian churches. Because it promotes chastity before marriage, and it promotes pro-life. And I have nothing against chastity. I have nothing against being pro-life, believe me. But, as you'll see, there's a lot wrong with these books. Now, parenthetically, before we continue, it's important to note that the lady that wrote these books is named Stephanie Meyer, and she is a devout Mormon.
There you go.
Some of you may know Mormons are very pro-life. They're very pro-family. Other than believing in having a lot of wives, they're pro-chastity. So, but I'm not doing a talk on Mormonism, right? So, sorry, save that for another night. Well, the fact that they're pro-chastity and pro-life are excellent biblical values, there's a lot of bad stuff in these books. The Apostle Paul writes against doing or promoting anything evil that good may come of it. That's Romans 3:8. He also tells us in 1 Corinthians 15:33, be not deceived. Evil communications corrupt good manners. You got to realize, these books make becoming a vampire so appealing and compelling. Impressionable teenage girls, which is the primary audience, and like 80% of the people who read these books are teenage girls, cannot help but be drawn into this seductive image. Now, here's the deal. Bella is just self-described as kind of clumsy, awkward, like a lot of teenagers. She doesn't think of herself as being very pretty. And it makes her, because I don't want to spoil the books for anybody, but by the fourth book, she's turned into a vampire. And she becomes this graceful, gorgeous woman instead of a clumsy, plain girl. Vampirism promises her that she will live forever, indestructible, young, and beautiful. Now, what young girl wouldn't want that? Now, if vampires were just fantasy creatures, this might not seem so alarming. But, contrary to many Christian things, vampires are to a degree very, very real. This is not about a young girl fantasizing, oh, I want to be a fairy princess. Because in reality, there aren't fairy princesses. This is about a girl imagining being turned into a real creature of Satan. This is about a girl with this fantasy being able to touch base with vampire internet sites with a couple of clicks of her mouse. Because believe me, I did this the other day. You just hit Google, you type in vampires, and 500 bazillion vampire sites are out there. Some of them, of course, are about fan fiction and whatnot. But a lot of them are about real people looking to touch base with you, looking to reach out and touch someone with their teeth. Now, when I read the books myself, because I did research, I read all 4 of these books, unfortunately, I could feel myself being drawn into this. Now, mind you, I do have a little history with it, but still, I'm a mature Christian. I mean, I've been saved since 1984. I've been doing deliverance on people since 1988. Anyhow, how much more would an adolescent girl be drawn into these things?
Yeah,
Because again, they're young, they're impressionable, they don't have a really good sense of who they are, a sense of what their selfhood might be. That brings us to the next thing. There's some serious emotional concerns over and above the spiritual ones in these novels. Bella is not a good role model, in spite of her chastity, in spite of her pro-life stance. For example, once she falls for this Edward guy, it's like he's the center of her universe. She has no life beyond him once she falls for him. He's like a drug to her. It's a kind of idolatry. I mean, she is utterly absorbed with him. At one point, she says he's like the sun around which she revolves. Her family and friends all recede before him. I mean, she lies to her father, she lies to her mother, who are in separate states. I think I kind of explained that, but anyhow, her friends are totally gone, presently. I mean, they're like peripheral once she's got him. Also, she's a weak woman with very little ego strength. She thinks nothing of herself, which is not uncommon for a child of divorce. But it's not good. And in the second novel, something happens at the end of the book. They're having a birthday party for Bella, and she gets a paper cut opening up a present. And one of the members of this family, quote unquote, vampire family that Edward is in, the Cullens, is a fairly, I should explain something. The thing that makes these novels more palatable is that all the main vampires in the novel are vegan vampires. What does that mean? Well, that means they refuse to drink human blood. They refuse to kill anybody. They go out and they hunt game. They'll bring down a stag or a deer or a bear or something and eat animal blood. They're moral, good vampires, so that makes it okay. But this young guy in the Cullen family is fairly new to this abstinence lifestyle, if you will. And so when he smells and sees the blood dripping out from this paper cut, it's like, "Argh!" And he almost attacks and kills her, just that quick. And so Edward freaks out. He thinks at that point that he is not good for her. Duh. So he says, I'm leaving you. I'm never going to see you again. I'm getting out of your life. The whole family, we're going to disappear. So just forget about me. And this just destroys her. I mean, she's utterly shattered beyond what is normal, beyond what is healthy. And I know. I had adolescent psychology 101. I mean, I'm a trained master's level counselor. When you're a teenager, small catastrophes seem enormous. But this is way over the top. I mean, she withdraws into this profound depression. I mean, she won't see her friends. She just goes to school, does her homework, and stays in bed all the time. I mean, if I were to see her, I would say she was clinically depressed. And she becomes self-destructive because she discovers something. She discovers that if she does something really dangerous, Edward suddenly shimmers around her like a phantom, and she sees him, kind of like an astral vision. And so she does stuff like drive motorcycles really fast, or jump off cliffs, or goes and flirts with a bunch of hoodlums on the street at night, things like that, just to see a glimpse of her missing boyfriend. Now, is that healthy behavior? Remember, this is the most popular female heroine right now for teenage girls in the world. Edward also is emotionally abusive and very controlling. But yet, like many abused women, she clings to him, even though he is abusive. He tries to control all her behavior. He isolates her from her family and friends. He is constantly checking up on her, and major creepy, he stands there all night and watches her sleep. Because you see, vampires don't have to sleep. I should explain that in these novels, a few tweaks are done to the vampire mythos. Edward does not have to stay out of the sunlight because it will turn him into a crispy critter. He has to stay out of the sunlight because if he walks into the sunshine, his skin glitters like diamonds, and his true supernatural identity will be revealed. So, see, again, there's this attempt being made to make vampires more and more noble, more and more godlike, less and less.
More
If you
pretty.
flee the light, then some of that makes you sound evil, doesn't it? And at the end of the second novel, after this long period where Bella is like moping and being depressed and trying to jump off cliffs and whatnot, he himself tries to kill himself. So this is really great. You know, when you think of the high level of suicide rate among our teenagers these days, Bella will do anything for Edward, including lie to her family. Her love consists of a deep intensity and burning devotion that should really only belong to the Almighty, not to any human being. Let me just say something. This is kind of peripheral to this, but in a way it isn't. I am speaking as someone who was happily married for 36 years to my wife until she passed away last month. But if you are trying to get total fulfillment of your soul out of your spouse or your boyfriend or your girlfriend, you're out of luck. You're never going to find it. Because there's only one being in the universe that can totally fill your heart. And it's not your honey. It's Yeshua. And even if you're a Christian, and I know many Christians that are single are walking, I got to find the one woman or the one guy in my life that God wants for me, blah, 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 and then we'll be perfect. And no, you won't. There ain't no such thing as a perfect marriage. Because there ain't no such thing as perfect people. There's not one perfect person on earth today. The only one that was perfect was Yeshua. So my point, I guess, is that the fact that she is so all obsessed and all encompassed with this guy, it's not healthy. It's not healthy for a teenager. It's not healthy for an adult. She says that literally she's willing to lose her soul to be with him. Now, let me just put this in a more mundane setting. Imagine you have a teenage daughter and you're a parent, and she wants to go out and fornicate with her boyfriend, have premarital sex. And you say, if you do that, that's a serious sin. That's a grave sin in the sight of the Almighty. She says, I don't care, she says. I'd be willing to lose my soul just for one night of heaven with him. That's what this same thing is being addressed in these novels, except in a more esoteric way. Let's look at the Cullen family for a moment. I ain't going to go into a lot of depth on this because I don't have time, but they're this perfect family. He's a doctor, and they're not even a family. None of them are even related, except by the fact that most of them, the husband of the family, bit them and turned them all into vampires. But they have no other relationship. But he's got a wife who's the mother of the family, and then they've got, I think, five siblings that are all, again, unrelated except by the fact that they're all vampires. And they've chosen to live together and live this vegan vampire lifestyle. And they're all perfectly beautiful. Every single one of them is more handsome or more beautiful than the last. They're impossibly beautiful. They're all very restrained. They're very warm. They're very compassionate, with a few minor exceptions here and there. They're like the perfect family. Now, remember, this lady is a devout Mormon that wrote these books. And what's impossible to avoid doing is contrasting Bella's human family with this perfect vampire family. Remember, Mormons have a bumper sticker. It says, families are forever. They believe the family unit is eternal. That will go on into the eternities, father, mother, and all the children. They will go off and become gods and goddesses. And their gods and goddess children will have gods and goddess children. They will start planetary systems and have their own planets. And they will be gods and goddesses over these planets and have billions of spirit children. This is Mormon theology, folks. And in a way, The Cullen family is a perfect families are forever family because they're godlike in their perfection. And then compare that to Bella's dysfunctional human family. I mean, her mother is this kind of flaky, new agey, ditz of a woman who can't even figure out how to turn on her cell phone half the time. And she's off running around the country with her ball player who's in the minor leagues husband. Her father is this nice but emotionally inept guy who's the sheriff of this town, or police chief, whatever, I forget. And, he's well-meaning, but he's kind of a dolt. I mean, if I was a father and all this stuff was going on in my house, I'd think I was the dumbest brain-dead guy around if I didn't see it. But he doesn't see it. So it's not a fair comparison. They're like the Mormon ideal. And this is not, I think, without intention. She's created a perfect families are forever paradigm, but she's made it exciting with this little soupçon of vegan vampirism. And believe me, she gets a lot of mileage out of this because there's other vampires in the novels that are not so nice. And of course, there's a vampire werewolf thing, which I won't even go into. Let's see. It's important to realize that the key tension in these books is the fact that Edward fears that if because this Bella, from the end of the first book, is just begging him to turn her into a vampire. In the start of the second book, she just turns 18 at a birthday party, and she already feels like the clock is ticking, like she's dying minute by minute. She's getting older every second, and he's going to be forever young, forever impossibly handsome, and she's getting old. She's going to be this old hag of 19. And so she's begging him to turn her into a vampire. And he won't do it because he and his father, Carlisle Cullen, have these theological questions, which is interesting. They don't know for sure if vampires have souls. And they're afraid that when they are finally destroyed somehow, because there are ways even in these novels to kill a vampire, that they may not ever get to heaven. And so he's afraid that if he turns Bella into a vampire, it will cost her her soul. And amazingly, in spite of all this, Bella is willing to give up her soul for love, and that's a direct quote right out of the novel. And the other thing you've got to realize is if you read these novels, there's a lot of what in the TV game they call ust. Ust. Not lust, but ust. Unresolved sexual tension. Ust. You see it all the time on TV shows. Where you've got two characters. The first example was in an old show, Moonlighting, where you had Sybil Shepherd and Bruce Willis, I think it was. And they were, are they going to do it? Are they going to do it? Are they going to do it for like 5 seasons or something? Well, the same thing is going on in these books. There's an enormous amount of sexual tension. And again, these are teenagers who already have raging
Same as that sitcom, The Nanny.
hormones. Reading these books, are they pornographic? Not in the least. But yet there's a lot of this just seething right underneath the surface type of stuff. With all these strange dynamics, is this the sort of literature you really want your young people reading? Is this the kind of stuff you want taught in your Sunday school? They actually have one lady, I forget her name, has actually got a study guide. She's a Christian Sunday school educator, expert. She has a degree in Christian education, and she's written a study guide about how you can take the 4 Twilight novels and use them in Sunday school.
Wow.
Now, and then any wonder why the church is this defanged, toothless, impotent whatever in the face of what the devil's trying to do these days. And these are our young people we're messing with. Brothers and sisters, these things ought not to be. And yes, I say this as a former vampire, but, it's like they say, never ask a recovering alcoholic about what he thinks about boobs either, or you'll get a 10-minute tirade. So just think of this as my tirade. The other thing is, as a guy who's been into counseling, I know how prone teenagers are to suicide. It's the #1 cause of death. among teenagers in this country. Interestingly enough, guess what the highest state in the union is for teen suicide?
New York?
Utah.
Oh,
Families
Mormons.
are forever country. And there's a whole lot of reasons for that, which I don't have time to go into. But just think about that in the light of these books. Okay, I promised you I'd tell about my little encounter with the undead. As you probably all know, I was involved with witchcraft, Mormonism, Masonry, Satanism, etc., etc. And as I said earlier, I came to this fork in the road where I could choose to either be a vampire or a werewolf. For reasons that should now be obvious, I chose vampire. So one of my satanic mentors took me down to this very, very strange church in Chicago, where I was first exposed to what is called the Nosferatu current. See, in high-level magic, it's believed there's these different currents that flow, kind of like different streams within a river. And there's a werewolf current, there's a Thelemic current, there's a vampire current. And this was a fountainhead. Because let me tell you, Chicago was a profoundly evil city. Not just because Al Capone used to be there. It was like one of the major satanic nerve centers of America in the 20th century, and probably still is today. And so through this, I was introduced to the guy who would eventually bring me into this cult. I was prepared with a bunch of magical exercises, given a strange cocktail of herbs, which I will not discuss because I don't want anybody trying this at home, and lots of vitamin B12, and lots of cocaine. And this was intended to gradually transform me into something other than human. So after a few months of this, this being came to our temple. We had a temple in our home up on the north side of Milwaukee, and he drank from my neck. He gashed open his chest, blood poured out, and I drank from his chest. And then I laid in a coffin that I had specially built. It wasn't just a coffin you go down to your funeral home and buy a garden variety coffin, casket, I guess they prefer to call it. It was specially designed, measurements down to the millimeter, certain angles, certain geometries. But let me ask you something. Why do you think caskets, the old coffins you used to see like in like westerns or whatever, why are they shaped like that? What are they? They're two trapezoids, one like this and one like this. What is the trapezoid, you might ask? The trapezoid is the key symbol of the Church of Satan. The inner order that I was a member of the Church of Satan as a second-degree warlock is called the Order of the Trapezoid. That's why haunted houses are typically with mansard roofs, like the Addams family house. Those are called mansard roofs. Perfect place for demons to come in. Trapezoids attract demons. This was an alchemical crucible that I would sleep in that would gradually turn me into a vampire. It had magical glyphs all over the inside of it. And oddly enough, it was built out of the same wood that the Ark of the Covenant was built out of. It was lined with silk and satin. Silk is an excellent conductor of electricity. Finally, after 3 days, I rose from this coffin as a vampire initiate. I was not a full-blown vampire. As I mentioned earlier, that would not happen until I finally died. But I could not drink anything but blood. I could not eat anything but Holy Communion from a Catholic Mass. Fortunately, I was a Roman Catholic priest in the old Roman Rite, so I just said Mass every day. Fortunately, I had a whole bunch of women in my coven, hundreds of them, about 7 or 8 of which were the high-level women that were more than delighted to let me bite them in the neck. And part of the transformation was that my saliva became full of a cocaine-like substance, just like a vampire bat. So I could lick their necks, it would anesthetize them against the pain, then my fangs would literally grow with arousal from smelling their blood, which I could smell from across the room. And I would bite them in the neck, and the teeth going into the neck would also introduce some of this powerful cocaine-like substance, so they'd get a huge rush. They said it was better than sex. And they loved it. But I needed more. I needed more and more because blood is worse than heroin. Blood is worse than cocaine. It's the most addictive substance on earth, I believe. And there are many people in the field of addictions that study sanguinarian addicts, addicts that are addicted to blood. Not all of them are vampires. Some of them are just nuts. I mean, they're just people that like drinking blood, but they have none of the other trappings of it. They've just grown fond of blood. And what's funny is I just thought of this. I never thought of this before. When I was in high school, I was such a klutz. I'd get out in physical education, and people would throw me the ball, and I'd get hit in the head with it. You know, I was like the kid no one would ever throw the ball to because they knew I'd drop it or something, or it would drop me. So finally, the coach realized I was not getting any exercise standing there, you know, like having people hit me with baseballs. And so he had, hey, why don't you go lift weights? So I actually liked that. So he got me a bench press thing and a barbell and dumbbells, and I was lifting weights. And one day I was lifting weights, and all of a sudden my gums started bleeding because I had braces. A lot of high school kids did, but I must have strained a little too hard with the weight. And I asked the coach, what do I do? My mouth is bleeding. I don't know. He was a PE teacher. He wasn't a doctor. And this was a little Catholic school. We had no nurse. And so I walked around the whole day swallowing my own blood. The whole day swallowing blood. And finally I come home, walk in the and of course all day my teeth are like, you know, full of blood. Anyway, I come home, I smile at my mother, she goes, ah, what's going on? She called desperately, my orthodontist says, oh, put a tea bag on it. So she got a Lipton tea bag, slapped it on where it was bleeding, and within like 10 seconds it stopped bleeding. So that's a little freebie there if your gums ever start bleeding. I wonder now if that might have been part of the beginning, the open door. I'll tell you, I could not go out in sunlight. If I did, I'd get like serious sunburns literally within about a minute. I'd have to wear a big, fortunately I still had my Amish hat from when I was a druid, big black brimmed hat. I couldn't come within 100 feet of garlic. You might say, why is that? Well, garlic is a blood purifier. I'd walk into the health food store, and there'd be this big rope of garlic hanging in the corner of the produce section. I could literally make my skin itch from like as far away as that banner is. You might ask, what was the deal with Holy Communion in the Catholic Church? Well, see, the Catholic Church teaches that within the little host and within the chalice of blood is the entire body, blood, soul, and divinity of Jesus Christ. When you take that, you're consuming all the body, blood, soul, and divinity of Jesus Christ. So I'm getting a whole, whatever it is, 9 quarts of blood that are in a human body? I forget now. I used to know that by heart, but I haven't had to worry about that in the last 25 years or so. And so it helped. But even so, I kept needing more. I kept needing more. Because like any addiction, you need more and more of the same substance to get the same buzz. An interesting thing happened. This thing about the cocaine in my saliva, I was a Mormon by now. Mormon vampire, yeah, go figure. And I couldn't afford dental insurance, and one of my friends in the elders quorum was a 4th-year dental student. And he said, I'll work on your teeth for free. I'm top of my class, don't worry. So I go and I had dental work ever since I become a vampire. This sounds so weird somehow. Anyhow, so I sit down on the chair, and he starts, this is before AIDS, so he was working bare fingered. They didn't wear gloves in those days. And all of a sudden, he started dropping his tools. He says, you have the weirdest thick saliva I've ever seen. And all my fingers are numb. He says, it's like I just used Novocaine on my fingers. I go, oops. You know, so he actually did end up wearing rubber gloves to work on my teeth. But fortunately, in my normal unaroused state, my teeth looked perfectly normal. It was only when I got excited that they grew a little. So I would celebrate Mass every day. And
see, that's a detail you don't make up, hey? Don't you think, guys?
say the rosary every day, and then night, I would go out and work as a newspaper man, putting newspapers in boxes in the middle of the night for the Milwaukee Sentinel. And I'll tell you, it was getting harder and harder for me to not, if I'd see a drive along, I'd see an occasional prostitute or an occasional street person or something out in the wee hours of the morning, not just leap out of the car and rip their throat out. Because I wasn't getting enough blood. And I was desperate because I love my wife so much. I didn't want to rip her throat out, for one thing, because she was one of the several women I was partaking of. And I was afraid if I ended up killing someone, it would ruin our lives, it would ruin her, it would shatter her, it would destroy our marriage. I'd end up out in a loony bin or like, Jeffrey Dahmer or something. And see, Milwaukee produces a lot of weird people. Jeffrey Dahmer isn't the only one. Anyway, so I didn't know what to do. And I was getting pretty desperate. I should also mention that we also performed a vampire mass every Friday night at midnight. It was called the Missa Nosferatu, which again, Nosferatu is the Romanian word for undead. And we would actually call upon Vlad Tepes as kind of a dark Christ figure. And we would say the words over a silver chalice, and his blood would come into the chalice, literally. In fact, I'll never forget that it was my sister-in-law. We initiated her into the first level of this vampire thing, and at the moment of the words of institution being said, which is like the hocus pocus part of it, the chalice burst into flames. Just like that. It melted the chalice. She was impressed. I was freaked out. So, anyhow, I was getting more and more desperate. And, that's me during my vampire period. And I was nearly hitting bottom, but I was hitting bottom because I knew soon that I was going to kill someone. I thought of the cartoon of the two vultures. You may have seen this, where they're sitting on a branch together, and I plead in public with this, "Patience, my foot. I'm going to kill someone." That's how I was feeling. Well, anyhow, at that point is when the part of the story some of you may have already heard started happening. And some Satanist girls came up from Chicago to see the great satanic priest. And, I'm sorry, I left out a part. I had sent a check off to the Church of Satan, my $20 a year dues. When it came back from the bank, some lady had written on the check, "I'll be praying for you in the name of Jesus." And at the time, I just sneered, because at that time I was so far gone, I thought Jesus was the son of Satan. So I just threw the check in the bank and forgot about it, in the vault, and forgot about it. Well, then, these two girls show up at the door from Chicago. They were like satanic groupies, teenage girls, and they wanted to meet me. And so I invited them in and had an audience with them. And they brought these two chick comic books, Spellbound and Angel of Light. And they marked them all up with rude remarks and everything. And one was about the dangers of the occult, and one was about how Satan is the great deceiver. And he says, "You got to read these things. They're so stupid. They're so moronic. You'll love them. You'll get a kick out of them." I just threw them in the door and forgot about it. See, the Lord couldn't find, evidently, a Christian that had enough nerve to come and witness to me. I mean, our house was so scary in the neighborhood. He never even had Jehovah's Witnesses come to our door. And you know how bad that is? And, I can't imagine why the neighborhood was scared. We were out there every full moon in the backyard wearing black robes going, "Ego, Azorak, Ego, Zomalak," all this stuff. I can't imagine why the neighborhood was scared. Might have been the big inverted pentagram we had hanging in the upstairs window. I mean, who knows? Anyway, so I forgot about it. But the next day, Mormon missionaries show up at our door. And so we thought this was a sign from God for reasons I don't have time to go into. And we ended up joining the Mormon church. We got used 5 years in the Mormon church as a spiritual decompression chamber. But I want to say one quick thing. The power of that lady's prayers are this. After about a day or two of feeling awful, From the time I got that check in the mail, I was delivered from my craving for blood addiction and delivered from a craving for cocaine, which I was majorly addicted, just like that. And I don't even, it's never been a concern, either the blood or the cocaine, ever since then. And that was 1981. So it's been, whatever that is. I can't do that math in my head. It's been nearly 20 years. I'm clean and sober. I never went to Narcotics Anonymous. Anyway, so Jesus ultimately used the LDS Church, the Mormon Church, to get me to a place where I was reading the Bible, and I finally read Romans 10, 9, and 10, and I read Galatians. I realized Paul could not have been a Mormon. I realized I needed something beside the Mormon Church, and I got born again on June 22nd, 1984. By way of conclusion, I want to say these things. I've been through this stuff. I know this stuff is not fantasy. It is deadly real, and it's deadly serious. But I also need to say that there's no evidence that these vampires are actually immortal. For all I know, they're, just weird perverts that like drinking blood. But the demonic power behind these things is not to be denied. Many of the ones you encounter on the internet are very dangerous, may even be criminals. But none of this makes them any less deadly. Christian parents need to help keep these kind of materials away from our young people, even at the risk of appearing to be not cool. And some parents, that's like the worst thing. Oh, you're not cool, Dad. Well, tough. You ain't reading those godforsaken books. Remember this, too. James says in his epistle 3:1 that if you're a teacher, you bear a much stronger responsibility than if you're a layperson. And if you're, as a teacher in Sunday school, promulgating these things, that little statement Yeshua said about if you harm one of these little ones, Mark 9:42, it would be better that a millstone was thrown around your neck and you'd be drowned in the depths of the sea. So we need to take this very seriously, because I would hate to be a Christian educator who was using these materials and then I found out that a young girl or a young man in my charge had decided to get on the internet and get involved in vampires. Because this stuff is not good. Realize all of this stuff, vampirism and whatever, is just a pallid counterfeit. Because Yeshua offers you real eternal life, not shambling around a graveyard all pale and afraid of garlic, but real eternal life in a glorified, resurrected body that has powers that dwarf anything you've ever read in vampire fiction or vampire fact. So choose him. I chose him in 1984, and I never looked back for a minute. So thank you very much for coming tonight. God bless you. And so she is known as the mother of demons and kind of the mother of all vampires. And she's sort of the patron saint, if you will, of crib death. Today we call that SIDS, sudden infant death syndrome, when a baby mysteriously dies and there's no evident cause. Well, some Orthodox Jews would blame that on Lilith to this very day.
Wow.
In fact, they actually have a talisman. When a baby is born, there's all sorts of strange superstitions in Orthodox Judaism about this. That's why they won't name a baby until after he's circumcised. Because if they name him before he's circumcised, then Lilith might get him. The other thing they do is they put this amulet over the crib from the moment the baby's, home from the hospital, and it has 3 names on it: Sanbi, Sansanbi, and Samangalef. Those are the names of 3 angels that supposedly the Almighty created to keep Lilith away from babies. And so they pray and ask Sanbi, Sansanbi, and Samangalef to keep Lilith away from the baby. Now, I had to explain all that just to explain that Lilith is the, if you will, the Hebrew version of the vampire legend. And again, this isn't in the Bible, although there are some interesting elements where Lilith appears to show up in the Bible. For example, a lot of Bible scholars will tell you that the screech owl in Isaiah 34:14 is a reference to Lilith. Also, the terror that is by night, that's mentioned in the 91st Psalm, verse 5, is considered by some to be a reference to Lilith. And we got to understand something. These pagan deities that surrounded Israel, because remember, Paul tells us that the gods of the heathen are demons. So whether that god is Allah, or whether that god is Lilith, or whether it's Molech or whatever, these are demonic powers. These are demonic strongholds. And there's this concept in the occult that's called...
Okay, guys, that loop, we've already watched that. So I'll finish off with a sky watch.
2017, the world started the official disclosure of UFOs. In 2017, the world started the official disclosure of UFOs when the government finally admitted publicly their involvement in the research of what they're calling unidentified aerial phenomenon. Now, thousands of UFO sightings are captured every year by people all over the world, and with the use of cell phones, video documentation has never been more broadly available. With millions of people now believing that aliens are the creators of humanity, as Christians, how are we supposed to respond to this growing trend? Today's guest is here to explain all of this right now. Hello, everybody, and welcome to Skywatch TV. I'm Joe Horn. Are you guys thrilled to start week 3 of our special investigation? The last couple of weeks have been unbelievable, and I'm going to introduce to you our special guest because he's back again. He's an Air Force veteran, author, radio show commentator, podcaster, and public speaker. He's the writer of Gen 6 Productions, Mega Drought, and The Lies of Men and Gods. Please welcome Mr. Daniel Holdings. I think we broke TV last week, Derek. We got into the Vatican. We were talking about their seeming, is obsession too strong? And that doesn't go for all people identifying as Catholic. Sure. But we did talk about those in high places of authority and persuasion that absolutely have this fixation with our space brothers, or whatever they would describe these entities to be.
If that show didn't get us canceled, then nothing will.
Oh, yeah. We continue our special series on the brand new film by Steve Quayle, Lies of Men and Gods, Exposing the Fallen Angel Agenda, the Genetic Corruption and Destruction of the Human Race. And we're back again with lead writer and co-producer, Mr. Daniel Holdings. And I want to dive right back into the conversation, as I've teased in the introduction over the last couple of weeks, this moment of alien disclosure. It's something that people have talked about for decades. It's something that people have hypothesized the government knows exactly when is going to happen, or they're picking their sunset date for the big reveal. We've talked about over the last couple of weeks, what is in it for the Vatican? Why do they seem so compelled to stay at the front end of this conversation? Why would they be if these aliens, as we describe them, or demons, as we describe them, are indeed communicating with members of the Vatican? What's in it for them? What is that relationship about? And of course, Tom, you eloquently explained last week that your belief is that they're positioning themselves to be the world authority when disclosure takes place. It's to say, hey, we've been in touch with our space brothers for decades. We're the answer people. We can both provide to you the explanations about what their technology means, because they've been educating us for the last 50 years, 60 years, but also the spiritual side of it. Would they be superior to us? Maybe we should turn to them for answers about where the cosmos began, et cetera, et cetera. So, Daniel, you've described this as the great deception. Do you think that we actually will face a moment where we're going to be told that aliens are our creators?
Yes.
Again, to the title of the movie, it's a lie, and it's already a lie that's being propagated. See, this is the issue. People already believe that aliens are our creators. And let's see, there are 65% of people that believe in God in the United States, but 45% believe in aliens.
Mm-hmm.
And so
Astonishing.
this is the parallel life that we are living right now. The fact that we are living in this world where you see this momentum go. I read an interesting article the other day. It said, can the Christian church ever rebound? Meaning, talking about the great falling away. And because we know it's the great falling away, and if you look at Scripture, I don't think so. At least not mainstream Christianity, not denomination Christianity. Certainly, I think there will be home churches and people looking toward the Lord more than ever in a personal one-on-one relationship. But the idea of religion is going by the wayside. We talked even before the show, Derek, about the woke religion, how that's religion. Here's the point that pulling away from religion, not God, not the Word of God, right? But pulling away from religion leaves a vacuum. Somebody's got to fill that vacuum.
Absolutely.
How do they do that? They do that with aliens, Tom.
Yes. Well, you know what's interesting is when we came down off of Mount Graham, Joe, and you remember we were contacted by one of the leaders of the Apache Nation, because I had gone on Sid Roth and said they went to federal lawsuit to try to stop them from building, the observatory on the top of Mount Graham, that they had done that because that was kind of like a burial ground, like a graveyard for the Indians, over the centuries, and they didn't want them up there disturbing their holy ground. Anyway, I said that on Sid Roth, then I get contacted by a leader of the Apache Nation. He said, that part of it is true, as far as what you've said. But he said, that's not really the issue. The issue for us is Mount Graham is one of the 4 holiest mountains in the whole world to all American indigenous people. And it is, he said, because it is, in your lingo, he said, you would call it a stargate. Yeah, a doorway, a portal, through which entities have entered into and exited this 3-dimensional reality since the dawn of time. And then he told me their creation story from the Apache, PhD level. And he's saying that here's how it happened. He said, in the beginning, there was nothing, darkness and void. And literally every part of the Old Testament description of creation is their oldest story of creation, but in their own way of saying it, right? So he said, above the mountain, a doorway opened. And he said, a silvery disc descended down out of heaven. Here's the UFO myth, right? And in it, he said, set a bearded man, which is very interesting given that the Apache don't have facial hair, so why they would have even depicted it that way. But that's more of a biblical narrative, right? A bearded man. He was the creator. He started making all of the good things that are on the world. But then he said, not long after that, the portal opened again, and a serpentine entity came through, and it started claiming that it was the creator. So the origin of the lie goes back right to, when Lucifer fell, the whole story of who is our creator, who is our God. And then he said after that, they go in their kivas, they start practicing witchcraft. The bowels of the earth burst open and giants come up out from under the surface of the earth that start spreading chaos. Anyway, the story goes on and on. And so the bearded guy, the God of the creator, dealt with those giants by sending a universal flood that went around the world and wiped out all of the reptilian species and all the rest of it. I want to preface this by making sure the audience understands. We've said a lot about the Vatican. It's important because in terms of geopolitical power and authority, they have embassies around the world. They have 90-some representatives from all the nations of the earth that meet at the Vatican. They're the only church in the world that has that kind of power and authority, so they would be the ones naturally at the forefront of this. But I want people to understand, having said all that, we are not anti-Catholic. That's not what we're doing here. No. We're not bashing Catholic Christians. What we're saying is that at the highest levels, to use a Malachi Martin term, of the geopolitics of the Vatican City, they know something, or they think they know something about what is going on. Now, are they making a deal with entities? Is it a Mephistophelian bargain, right? Is there something like that that's going on? Well, watch this. A Catholic priest, an astronomer that works with everybody we've been talking about so far, Kenneth Delano, he wrote in an officially sanctioned Catholic book not long ago, he wrote this, quote, our religious sensitivities ought not to be shocked by the idea that the evolutionary history of the human body might be traced back ultimately to a primordial refuse heap left by visiting ETI, or extraterrestrial intelligence, when Earth was young. So in other words, we were created by the aliens, right? And then he ends it with this flabbergasting statement, quote, no great theological difficulty should present itself if we discover that ETI played an important part in the formation of the human race, end quote. So there you go. And I have dozens of quotes from their highest level academics. They are definitely trying to prepare You know, at least Catholics, if not others around the world. And you're right. I'll quit talking now, but you're right. You know, as interest in God wanes across the United States, throughout Europe and the UK, the belief in aliens in particular is growing like crazy. So it's only going to take one event. If they find some artifact on another planet somewhere that's an alien structure of some kind, or they dig up something out from under the soil here, one event, or ultimately what you were saying a moment ago, you know, we wake up one morning and we turn on the news, and here in the well of the United Nations is the President of the United States, the President of Britain and Russia and all the rest of them, the Pope, and maybe even that character out of Childhood's End that looks suspiciously like the devil, but we are being sold that that is actually who made us who we are. They are our saviors. And now they're here to correct our understanding of the gospel.
And just to emphasize points that Tom and Daniel both made, this is not about the Vatican or Roman Catholics in general, and it's much worse than what Daniel said. When Josh Peck and I wrote The Day the Earth Stands Still back in 2017, the Barna Group found that even though about 2/3 of Americans say they believe in God, the fact is that only 10% of Americans have a biblical worldview, meaning believing in the basic tenets of Christianity, that God created the universe, that Jesus literally died and rose again from the dead, born of a virgin, Satan is a literal entity, and so forth. And among those who identify themselves as Christians and say that their faith is important and attend church regularly, only 17% actually have a biblical worldview. The point is, 1/3 of Americans believe that it is likely, somewhat or very likely, that Earth has been visited by extraterrestrial entities, and only 10% have a biblical worldview. There are more of them than there are of us. So the situation's worse than what you even
That
said.
speaks to this whole issue of disclosure. You asked me, I don't know if it was the last show or this show, you asked me if I thought the aliens were going to disclose themselves, or if there was going to be a disclosure moment. I think we're just what you said. I think we're going to wake up one day and all of a sudden, in fact, I saw it. I don't want to get too super spiritual here, but when I was writing my first trilogy, the Lord gave me lots of dreams and visions, and that was one of the things that I saw. He gave me that. All these UFOs appearing over the United Nations, and then the head of the United Nations walking out and greeting them. They disclose themselves. I don't know if it'll play out exactly like that, but I think that's exactly what will happen, because if we leave it to the military or the governments of the world, they want that technology. They want that power. If they allow the public to begin to see the kind of information they have, the governments of the world lose their power, and therefore they won't do it because they're trying to hold on to their power. But yeah, I wanted to make a point here. Steve Quayle, producer of the movie, he is so focused at times, and you know him well, Tom, so you know exactly what I'm talking about. When I began to come across some of this information, his eyes grew like saucers, and he said, "Wait a minute, that needs to go in the movie." I know, that's why I'm talking to you about it. But one of the things that you mentioned, a name that you mentioned, was Corrado Balducci. Corrado Balducci was a good friend of Zecharia Sitchin.
Yes.
And so in the beginning, you saw the Vatican and Zecharia Sitchin at opposing odds of their belief system in aliens. Because if you know anything about Zecharia Sitchin, he wrote The 12th Planet and other books, but he believed that the Anunnaki lived on planet Nibiru, and that they would come around in our sphere of influence, our polar orbit, every 3,600 years. And so what he tried to do is to convince the Vatican of this. The Vatican said, no, that's not the case. Along comes Corrado Balducci, who becomes friends. They begin to trade artifacts. They begin to trade information. Lo and behold, eventually the Vatican, to your point, 100% convinced that that is in fact the case. Now, how do we know this? Because we have on camera a good friend of Zecharia Sitchin before he died that talks about Zecharia Sitchin's belief and how he converted the Vatican into believing about aliens. So, as strange as this story can get, his name was Mario Firamonti. Mario Firamonti actually said some other wild things, and we'll disclose it here in just a second. But the idea that aliens are our creators was something that came not necessarily from Balducci. It was from Zecharia Sitchin, who, by the way, now this is crazy, right? He was writing his first book. It came out in 1973, and he was frustrated because he supposedly interpreted Sumerian tablets, the 13 tablets of Enki, and the Hebrew out of Genesis 6, and came to the conclusion of the Anunnaki. But scholars at that time didn't agree with him. In fact, they refused to believe him. So he was so frustrated. He's writing the manuscript of his first book, and in his own words, in frustration one night, he sits back and he says this. Now, this says chills down my spine as I'm beginning to relate this to you.
Mm-hmm.
He says this. He says, Nephilim, if you exist, please tell me what is Nibiru. Now, tell me what is Nephilim.
Yeah, the spirits at least of the giants of the Old Testament.
Well, actually, the fallen angels. They are fallen angels. He's asking the fallen angels, the aliens, to disclose themselves.
Mm-hmm.
That's crazy. So this is the guy that convinced the Vatican that there are aliens and they are our creators.
And he himself was first deceived before some of the Vatican was, because he started reaching out to these illegal entities. And they responded by opening his mind.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the demons go where they are invited, right?
Yeah.
And
I'm looking at Sitchin's website right here, where he recounts the conversations that he's had with Monsignor Balducci, and how Balducci said, well, the Anunnaki maybe we're carrying out God's will in bringing spirit to humanity. Like, okay, that's kind of exactly the opposite of what the Bible tells us about these entities, because as our good friend Dr. Michael Heiser points out on his website, SitchinIsWrong.com.
He just died a couple of weeks ago, Michael Heiser.
I highly encourage you to read either Mr. Sitchin, God bless him, because he now knows the truth. He has since passed on. Either Mr. Sitchin could not read Sumerian, or he was deceived, or was deceiving, because his interpretation does not match what is actually on those tablets. And yet he has managed to convince some very influential people that these entities, who we know with the Divine Council worldview that Dr. Heiser has taught us, were actual entities, but these would be the fallen angels that Psalm 82 says are under a death sentence. Though you are gods, all of you, sons of the Most High, like men, you shall die.
right.
Donna, you know the word really well. Give me the verse from that Paul said about doctrines of demons, understanding or listening to doctrines.
The fact that you cannot drink from both at the same time. Yeah, you cannot have the doctrines of demons and the true Christian doctrine. You cannot drink from both at the same time.
And Joe, that's exactly what we're looking at right here.
Right.
This whole thing that Tom uncovered, 10 years ago, 12 years ago, without Exo Vaticana, we are looking at the doctrines of demons infiltrating the Vatican, and that Vatican making a means by which those demons or those fallen angels can come and basically take over the world. It is the lies of men and gods. It really is.
Wow. We're talking about lies of men and gods, and we want to make sure that you know how you can get your copy. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back.
There is a huge web of deception that has been intensified.
He does a couple of minutes of ads.
Welcome back to Skywatch TV. I'm Joe Horn. We're in studio today with lead writer and co-producer of the film Lies of Men and Gods, Daniel Holdings. And Daniel, right before the break, you did such a beautiful job kind of encapsulating all the commentaries that Derek and Tom had put forth on this whole topic of the Vatican, ET disclosure, the timing of that. We did a lot of speculating, but you did mention Zachariah Sitchin's friend, Mario Faramonte, if I'm saying that correctly. And there's something more there that you wanted to reveal.
But okay, so let's go back and answer this question. Why is the Vatican going down the road that they're going? What is this belief system? You asked the question earlier. What's in it for them, right? Why are they going through? Do they get first dibs when the world's taken over by aliens, or it's like, hey, it's much, much deeper than that, and it has to do with a supernatural belief, a spiritual belief that is not biblical, by the way. As I mentioned, we interviewed Leo Sagami and Mario Faramonte. Mario Faramonte was a friend of Zachariah Sitchin's of 40 years. And so we had the opportunity, actually Leo brought Mario to the interview to answer some of these questions about Sitchin. Folks, you got to hear me. Remember I said that this movie caused Steve Quayle and I to look back and say how literal the Bible was.
Yes.
That Satan is the god of this world. That the whole world lies in the hands of the evil one. Now, okay, is that super spiritual, or is it ethereal?
Yeah, like a metaphor or reality.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So what Faramonti said is that Sitchin believed that one of those Anunnaki was living in planet Earth, underneath the Earth, and that his name was Lucifer, and that he was the head Anunnaki, and that he ruled this planet. Now, here's the interesting thing. So if you go back to Ephesians 6, verse 12, we wrestle not with flesh and blood, but with the principalities, powers, and forces of wickedness. You look at that word, forces of wickedness, it literally means, in the Greek, ruler of this world. This is not ethereal. This is not, hyperbole. This is real. Now, Tom, does that make more sense? Why, if the Vatican is in cahoots and they've come to this belief in the Anunnaki and Nibiru or whatever's coming, does that make more sense why they would name this infrared device the Lucifer god?
Yeah, well, and all through the Bible, I mean, Jesus spoke about this, the Apostle Paul spoke about this, in whom the God of this world hath blinded the minds of them which believe not, lest they should receive the glorious gospel of Christ and be saved. So there is a war. He is called in numerous places the God of this world. And in fact, when Jesus doesn't deny when he takes him up onto the Mount of Temptation, and he says, see all of this, all these nations and the worlds and the cities and the glory of them, I will give it all to you, for it is given to me, and it is my power to whom I will give it, if you will just bow down and worship me. Jesus didn't do that. He corrects him with scripture and rebukes him and all that, but he didn't deny that he is the God of this world, and to whom he will give it, right? So at the highest levels of, even America, I'm sorry, folks, even the United States government, there is supernaturalism that is operating behind the scenes. Yeah, there is. And there are stages in those categories: principalities, powers, rulers of darkness, spiritual wickedness in high places, cosmocrators. Even Heiser noted this in his book Unseen Realm, that this is referring to entities that exist and work in and behind human political counterparts. It is their job to steer nations, especially powerful ones, away from God. And that's what the God of this world is doing. So, and you do talk about this quite a bit in the film, and I really enjoyed that part of the film. It's informative to me about Sitchin's connection to Lucifer as the head Anunnaki, right? And so if they're coming back on this floating planet Nibiru, is that what Malachi Martin was referring to? They're studying something in deep space?
I think that there's another possible interpretation here. Nibiru is just an alternate way of transliterating in English the ancient Sumerian name Nippur. Nippur was the city that was sacred to the chief god of Mesopotamia, Enlil, who, by the time of Abraham, had been demoted with the Anunnaki from being the chief gods of Sumer to gods or judges of the underworld. I argued in the book, The Second Coming of Saturn, that god Enlil, also called El, Dagon, Molech by the Hebrews, Saturn, Kronos, is this entity, Lucifer. That Lucifer, in other words, is this entity, not Satan. Satan still roams the earth seeking about, whom he may devour. Whereas this entity, like the sinning angels mentioned by Peter and Jude, is locked away in the netherworld. So if he's looking at Lucifer in Nibiru, he's looking for Enlil from Nippur, the chief god of Mesopotamia, who I argued in that book is Apollyon or Abaddon, the destroyer who comes out in Revelation chapter 9. He's coming back, but they're not going to like it when he does.
And the fact that what you were saying about Sitchin, he's the chief Anunnaki and he lives beneath the surface of the earth. That is exactly where your studies went to as well. Revelation chapter 9, all the rest of it, right? That an angel descends down out of heaven with a key to the bottomless pit, and he opens it up, and then all Hades breaks
the king over those in the bottomless pit.
Right. So I know you're almost out of time, but this last point, let's make a left turn. The Great Reset that's coming, all these things that are coming together, famine, economic collapse, the killing off of millions with stuff, right? If that is true, is that being driven by this Lucifer who controls this planet? The lies of God and man.
Amen.
Now, Daniel, we're not going to have time to get into a lot of this today, but I do want to kind of pre-tease next week. A couple of weeks ago, you talked about these artifacts that you and Steve Quayle and your team went out and uncovered in Mexico. But you also allege in the film, for the viewers at home, that there's an Egyptian connection to those artifacts in Mexico, and that this is very significant. Give us just a sample of what we're going to be talking about next week.
Okay, guys, I'm out. See you tomorrow. God bless. Thanks for joining.